There is a moment, somewhere deep in a Fallout game, where the world stops feeling like a video game and starts feeling like an archaeology site. You are kneeling beside a skeleton in a ruined apartment building, reading a handwritten note left on a nightstand, and somewhere in the back of your mind something clicks. These people were real, at least inside this universe. They had names, routines, arguments about the heating bill, opinions about their neighbors, probably a preferred radio station and a particular way they liked their coffee. And then the bombs fell, and now you are here, picking through the beautiful wreckage of everything they left behind. That feeling is not accidental. It was designed by people who cared deeply about what they were making, who argued over every line of dialogue, who hid messages inside audio files, and left their initials inside texture maps where almost nobody would ever look. Fallout is a franchise built on layers. There is the layer you see when you first boot it up, and then there are the layers underneath, going down and down like a vault elevator that never quite reaches the bottom. Tonight we are going down there together. Get comfortable. Find your blanket. Let the hum of the Geiger counter be your white noise, and let me tell you the stories that even longtime fans have probably missed. We are going slow. We are going deep. And by the time we are done, you will understand why this series has lived in people's hearts for nearly 30 years, and why it shows no sign of letting go. Part 1. How Fallout Almost Did Not Exist. The story of how Fallout came to be is one of those sideways histories where every near disaster resolves into something better than what was originally planned. The game that would eventually shape an entire genre of post-apocalyptic storytelling was, at multiple points in its development, on the verge of being cancelled, redesigned into something unrecognizable, or simply abandoned by the people who were trying to make it work against considerable institutional resistance. It begins with a man named Tim Kaine. Kaine joined a company called Interplay Entertainment in August of 1991, starting as a freelancer working on something called the Bard's Tale construction set. It was dry, technical work, the kind that teaches you the bones of how games are assembled without hinting at the creative ambitions Kaine had nurtured since he was young. Interplay in those years was a scrappy, mid-sized developer with enough creative energy to try unusual things but not quite enough money to make failure painless or forgivable. The kind of company where good ideas could survive if someone cared enough to protect them, which is exactly what happened. In the mid-90s, Interplay acquired a license from Steve Jackson Games to use the GURPS system as the mechanical foundation for a new post-apocalyptic game. GURPS stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System, a beloved tabletop rule set flexible enough to support almost any genre or setting. It seemed like the perfect backbone for the kind of open, morally complex RPG that Tim Kaine and his team were starting to dream about. For a while, Kaine worked essentially alone on the project, building the engine from scratch. He was the programmer, the designer, and the one keeping the whole fragile thing alive while the rest of Interplay focused on other projects. There is something quietly remarkable about that image. One person, in an office full of people working on other things, building what would eventually become one of gaming's most beloved franchises largely by himself, driven by his own conviction that the project was worth the effort. The team believed, with reasonable confidence, that having GURPS in the title would give the game instant credibility with the hardcore RPG crowd. The working concept at the time was for a game set in a devastated, retro-futuristic version of California, drawing on the 50s-era nuclear paranoia that had never quite left American culture. Think bomb shelters and chrome cars and a Jetsons aesthetic overlaid on complete civilizational collapse. The team wanted something that felt simultaneously hopeful and deeply bleak, a world that had once believed in its own shining future and had been proven catastrophically wrong about almost everything it trusted. Then Steve Jackson himself saw a scene in the game. The specifics of what he saw have been discussed across various interviews over the years, but the general consensus is that the content involved a kind of violence that conflicted with Jackson's vision for how his game system should be represented publicly. GURPS, for all its flexibility, was a product with a public face, and that face did not include the kind of brutal, unflinching content that the Fallout team was building toward. Jackson canceled the licensing deal. Just like that, Interplay lost the rule set they had been designing around for over a year of development work. This could have been fatal. For most teams, losing your core mechanical system so deep into pre-production means starting over, closing the project entirely, or pivoting to something much safer and much less interesting. What happened instead was that a designer named Chris Taylor sat down and started writing. Taylor had developed his own RPG system in his spare time, sketched across index cards and notebook pages, and scraps of grid paper in the margins of other work. It was turn-based, stat-heavy, built around action points that governed every decision in combat. Moving one tile cost points, firing a weapon cost points, reloading cost points. Every choice had a weight attached to it, and that weight made every decision feel significant in a way that faster, more automatic systems could not quite replicate. Taylor adapted this personal system into what would become known as Specule, standing for strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. It became one of the most beloved mechanical frameworks in RPG history, instantly legible and endlessly customizable, the kind of system that makes every character feel like a genuine expression of how you want to approach the world you are inhabiting. The fact that it exists at all, the fact that you have been assigning points to those 7 attributes across multiple games for decades, is a direct consequence of a licensing deal falling apart at the most inconvenient possible moment, and a designer who happened to have something better already written down. For much of its development, the game was called Vault 13, after the underground shelter that serves as the player's starting home. Tim Kaine liked this title. It was evocative, mysterious, grounded in the world the team was constructing. But in early 1997, as the release date approached, Interplay's co-founder Brian Fargo raised a practical concern. If this became a series, what would the sequel be called? Vault 14? Vault 13 too? The naming convention had nowhere to grow. Fargo suggested they call it Fallout. Kaine's initial reaction, as he has described in interviews, was skeptical. He turned the word over, considered whether it actually captured what the game was trying to be. And then, something clicked. Fallout was not just the radiation that settled over a landscape after a blast. It was the invisible aftermath, the consequence that outlasted the catastrophe itself, the thing that was still present long after the explosion was forgotten. It described a condition more than an event, a state of being that persists rather than an incident that concludes. Kaine came around to it, and in the early months of 1997, the game that had been Vault 13 became Fallout. It released in October of 1997 with almost no marketing whatsoever. Kaine has described the launch in interviews as happening through what he called a kind of backdoor at Interplay. There were no press junkets, no preview events, barely any advertising. He recalls there being approximately 1 advertisement before the game shipped to stores. The company that published Fallout did not appear to believe they had something exceptional on their hands. The game arrived quietly, without the fanfare that games of its quality would normally receive, and waited for people to find it. They found it. Fallout connected with players in a way that very little else had at that point in gaming history. It was a role-playing game that trusted its audience completely, that let you kill important characters, fail quests in ways that permanently changed the world around you, and approach nearly every problem from multiple angles simultaneously. Its writing was dark without being nihilistic, cynical without losing its genuine emotional investment in the world it was describing. And underneath all of it was this carefully constructed alternate history, a version of America that had doubled down on nuclear power instead of embracing the transistor, where the aesthetic of the post-war 40s and 50s had been stretched forward through decades until it covered the end of the world itself. The creative team who built that world was small by modern standards. Around 40 people contributed to the original Fallout's development, each of them pouring something specific and personal into the wasteland. Leonard Boyarsky handled much of the visual and artistic direction, giving the game its distinctive look, the grotesque beauty of irradiated landscapes, the black humor of propaganda posters still hanging on the walls of ruined buildings decades after the war, the terrible cheerfulness of the Vault Boy mascot giving a thumbs up at the end of everything. Every visual choice was deliberate, and each one contributed to the argument the game was making about the relationship between optimism and catastrophe. Mark Morgan composed the soundtrack, writing dark ambient music that sounded like the end of something rather than the beginning. The game's writer, Mark O'Green, populated the world with characters who felt like people rather than plot devices, who had specific opinions and specific histories, and specific ways of responding to a world that had treated them very badly. The team was small enough that everyone knew what everyone else was doing, small enough that creative decisions could happen quickly and personally rather than through layers of approval and revision. That closeness, that awareness of what each person was contributing, came through in the finished product in ways that are still legible. Kane never wanted a sequel. He had envisioned Fallout as a complete, standalone story. After contributing to some early development work on a second game, he left Interplay to co-found a new studio called Troika Games, taking with him several key members of the original team. Fergus Urquhart stepped into the producer role for the sequel, leading a team of around 90 people to build on what Kane's small group had established. They had 9 months to do it, compressed by the financial pressures that were already beginning to crack Interplay from the inside. Fallout 2 came out in October of 1998, and it expanded the world in almost every direction while departing from the original's tone in ways that some players loved and others found jarring. Where the first game was spare and deliberately oppressive, Fallout 2 was frequently and unabashedly absurd. You could find a Volkswagen Beetle sitting incongruously in the middle of the wasteland. Characters made direct references to Monty Python. The game winked at the player in ways the first installment had carefully avoided, as though it had decided that the end of the world was funny, actually, when you thought about it long enough. This tonal shift defined a fault line within the fanbase that has persisted for decades. But even within the chaos of that rushed sequel, the world grew richer in ways that would pay dividends for every game that came after. New cities with distinct personalities, new factions with genuine internal logic, and, buried in the computers of Vault 8 and Vault 13, the first real hints that the vaults were not what they appeared to be, that the cheerful bunkers built to save humanity might have been designed to do something else entirely. That revelation, that Vault-Tec had not been in the business of saving humanity at all, would become the defining secret at the heart of Fallout's lore. Tim Kaine invented the concept of the Vault experiments during early pre-production work on Fallout 2 as a way of giving the Vault network a purpose that went beyond simply being bunkers full of people waiting out the apocalypse. The original Fallout had gestured at the idea with the Overseer working to keep residents underground far past any reasonable safety justification, but Kaine formalized it into something much darker. The vaults as a laboratory, humanity as the unwitting test subjects, survival as just one variable among many in an experiment that nobody in the vaults ever agreed to participate in. This idea has been expanded and elaborated across every subsequent game, each new entry adding new experiments, new horrors, new examples of what Vault-Tec was willing to do when given unlimited resources and no oversight. It became the series' central argument, the thing it keeps returning to, that institutions fail the people they claim to serve, that authority without accountability becomes monstrous, and that the machinery of civilization can be turned against civilization itself with very little difficulty if the right people are in charge and the wrong systems of accountability are absent. The story of how Fallout almost did not exist is also, in some ways, the story of how its darkest and most enduring ideas came into existence. The GURPS collapse forced the team to build something better. The minimal marketing forced the game to survive on the strength of what it actually was. The sequel's rushed timeline forced writers to reach further into the psychology of desperation and institutional failure than a more comfortable schedule might have allowed. And out of all of that difficulty came a world that has never quite been replicated. Before we continue, wherever you are right now, drop a comment telling me your location and the time. I find that genuinely interesting, knowing where people are listening to these things at these hours. And if you have not already, consider subscribing. These videos take a long time to put together, and knowing there are people out there listening through the night makes every hour of research feel worthwhile. Part 2. The Vault Experiments. Darker than you already know. The vaults are the defining architectural feature of the Fallout universe. When most people think about the series, they picture those heavy steel doors, the retro-futuristic corridors in pale green and yellow, the Vault Boy posters decorating the walls of places where genuinely terrible things happened. The vaults are home, and they are also horror. They are the most concentrated expression of everything the Fallout universe wants to say about institutions, authority, and the willingness of ordinary people to follow orders far past the point where those orders could be justified by any reasonable moral framework. Vault-Tec was, on paper, a defense corporation contracted by the United States government in the early 2050s to design and build a network of underground shelters capable of protecting segments of the American population from nuclear war. The project was called the Societal Preservation Program, and it was presented to the public as exactly what it claimed to be, a humane and forward-thinking response to the growing possibility of global conflict. Vault-Tec ran advertisements, They had a mascot whose permanently optimistic expression graced everything from corporate pamphlets to the walls of the shelters themselves. They sold survival with the same relentless cheerfulness that the era applied to everything: cars and kitchen appliances and breakfast cereals. The same bone-deep optimism that post-war American culture had stretched out until it covered even the prospect of nuclear annihilation. 122 vaults were planned and eventually built, depending on which game's documentation you consult. Almost none of them were genuine survival shelters. The truth about the Vault program, pieced together across multiple games through terminal entries and personal logs and environmental details scattered through the ruins, is that Vault Tech designed most of its facilities as elaborate experiments. The corporation, working in concert with the highest levels of the pre-war government, intended to use the Vault dwellers as unwitting test subjects, studying how isolated human populations would behave under extreme and carefully manipulated conditions. The Vaults were not designed to save people. They were designed to generate data, and the people inside were the most important variable in every study. This was not incidental to Vault-Tech's operation. It was central to it. The experiments were funded, staffed, and overseen by dedicated scientific teams. Overseers were briefed on the nature of their Vault's specific study and given instructions for maintaining the experimental conditions over potentially decades or longer. Scientists monitored outcomes from outside the Vaults and occasionally from within them, using cover identities to avoid revealing the nature of what was happening. The entire apparatus was built around keeping the test subjects in the dark, because the moment the subjects understood they were subjects, the experiment would be compromised. Vault 11, located in the Mojave wasteland of New Vegas, is perhaps the darkest single expression of this concept. The experiment at Vault 11 was designed with a kind of terrible clinical clarity. The inhabitants were told at the Vault's founding that they must sacrifice one of their own every year. A single person, chosen through whatever mechanism the population developed for itself, would be delivered to the Vault's automated systems. If they refused to make the sacrifice, the Vault's computer would execute the entire population. If they complied, life inside would continue for another year. What Vault Tech was actually studying, though the inhabitants could not have known this, was how quickly an isolated group would construct authoritarian social structures and moral frameworks around the act of killing one of their own. The answer, as documented across the Vault's terminals, is that they did it with remarkable speed and thoroughness. The dwellers built an entire political philosophy around the annual sacrifice. They held elections, but in a darkened version of normal democratic logic. Candidates for the position of overseer actively campaigned on platforms designed to make others choose them as the sacrifice instead. Winning the election meant safety for another year. Losing might mean being offered up to the machine. This dynamic continued, year after year, for generations. Factions formed along lines of who was protected and who was expendable. Alliances were forged through the logic of mutual protection rather than shared values. People made calculations about who could be sacrificed with the least disruption to their own social group's stability, what relationships could be leveraged, what skills or positions might argue in their favor when the time came to choose. The Vault became a controlled environment for observing how human beings rationalize violence when survival is the permanent frame around every decision. Eventually, the survivors stopped. What remained of the population collectively refused the annual sacrifice. And the Vault's computer revealed something that must have been almost physically devastating to understand. The threat had always been false. There was never going to be a consequence for refusing. The entire experiment had been running on a lie for generations, and every person who had died over all those years had died for nothing. The remaining dwellers killed themselves. Almost all of them. One survived, recorded a message urging that the world learn what had happened inside Vault 11, and left. When you walk through Vault 11 in New Vegas, you find the bones of this story scattered across the floors in exactly the arrangement that the Vault's history implies. The election campaign posters read like dark jokes that nobody in the Vault was capable of laughing at. The terminal logs document the political machinations of specific individuals, their strategies, their justifications, their moments of genuine horror at what they found themselves capable of. And in the depths of the Vault, in the sacrificial chamber, there is a quiet that feels heavier than ordinary silence, the quiet of a place where something happened that nobody who witnessed it survived long enough to describe. Research has cited the Milgram experiment as a specific influence on Vault 11's design. The Milgram experiment, conducted in the 1960s by psychologist Stanley Milgram, demonstrated that ordinary people would administer what they believed to be dangerous electric shocks to strangers, simply because a researcher in a lab coat told them it was necessary for the study. The participants were not unusual. They were regular members of the public who had placed the authority of the institution above their own moral judgment, who trusted that the person in the lab coat had reasons they did not fully understand, who kept going because stopping would mean admitting they had already gone too far. Vault 11 is a sustained meditation on this phenomenon, scaled up to the duration of human lifetimes and the stakes of actual death, running without a safety net for generations before anyone was in a position to call it off. Vault 75, found in Fallout 4 beneath Malden Middle School, took the experiment in a different direction but arrived at an equally disturbing destination. The Vault's residents were told that their children were receiving superior education and opportunities, that Vault Tech was investing in the next generation in ways that would pay dividends for humanity's recovery. This was accurate, in the coldest possible sense of the word. Vault Tech was extremely interested in the children. The actual experiment involved systematically separating children from their parents and subjecting them to a rigorous program of physical and psychological testing designed to identify individuals with exceptional genetic potential. Children who tested well enough were advanced through the program, eventually becoming candidates for the Vault's scientific staff as they grew older. Children who did not meet the required thresholds were, in the Vault's clinical language, removed from the program. The terminal entries in Vault 75 avoid stating plainly what removal meant. The skeletons in the lower levels answer the question clearly enough for anyone willing to descend far enough to find them. Children who survived long enough were either harvested for their genetic material upon reaching adulthood or recruited to help administer the same experiments on subsequent generations of children who would arrive knowing nothing of what had come before. In either case, the parents in the upper levels had no access to what was happening below. The cheerful educational messaging, the promises of superior resources and careful attention to developing minds continued throughout the facility's operational history. The architecture of the vault enforced the separation. The parents trusted the institution. The institution had never earned that trust and had no intention of doing so. Vault 92, glimpsed in Fallout 3's expanded documentation, housed musicians. Hundreds of some of the most talented performers in pre-war America were selected and brought underground, supposedly to preserve musical culture through the coming catastrophe, a noble enough premise in a world full of less noble ones. The actual experiment involved embedding white noise signals at specific frequencies in the Vault's audio system, signals designed to progressively lower inhibition and increase violent impulse in the people exposed to them over time. The Vault's overseers documented the results with academic precision and professional detachment. Vault 92's history is written almost entirely in blood, and the space it occupied, when you find traces of it in the game, feels less like a failed shelter than like a laboratory that completed its work exactly as designed. Vault 112, which the player visits during Fallout 3's main story, contains one of the series' most quietly disturbing premises. A brilliant and deeply unstable scientist named Stanislaus Braun had transferred his consciousness into the Vault's computer system before the bombs fell, trapping the other Vault residents inside a virtual reality environment called Tranquility Lane. When you reach this vault in Fallout 3, Braun has been running this simulation for approximately 200 years. The simulated environment is a 1950s suburban neighborhood, cheerful and perfectly maintained in the way that real suburban neighborhoods never actually were. All manicured lawns and optimistic facades, children playing, and neighbors waving over white picket fences. The residents of Tranquility Lane wander through it with their memories periodically reset, living out domesticity in an infinite loop while their physical bodies lie in pods in the real vault below. Braun has had 200 years with unlimited power over other human beings and absolutely no oversight whatsoever. The Vault records document what that kind of unchecked authority produces over 2 centuries, and it is exactly what you would expect from someone who discovered they were god of a very small world and had no one to answer to. Every atrocity is documented in the same neutral, administrative language as a maintenance schedule. The horror of what happened in Vault 112 is communicated not through dramatic presentation, but through the bureaucratic tone of the documentation, the way evil looks when it is doing its paperwork and has been doing its paperwork for so long that the paperwork has become ordinary. What makes the Vault experiments so effective as storytelling, across every game in the series, is the way they illuminate a particular kind of institutional evil that does not require theatrical villainy to function. The people who designed these experiments were, by every available piece of evidence, genuine scientists with genuine intellectual interests and genuine research goals. They published internal papers. They kept meticulous records. They constructed elaborate methodologies and tracked outcomes with professional rigor. The horror is in the ordinariness of the documentation, the way every atrocity is filed in the same neutral tone as an expense report, the way the institution made the monstrous feel routine. This is deliberately and explicitly connected to real patterns of institutional failure. Every major historical investigation into institutional evil finds the same structure: the bureaucratic normalization of decisions that, examined individually, would have been obviously monstrous, the incremental logic by which terrible things came to seem acceptable, the diffusion of moral responsibility across enough layers of institutional structure that no single individual ever felt personally responsible for the outcome of the whole. Vault-Tec did not need monsters to run these experiments. It needed administrators, and administrators were available in abundance. Vault 81, in Fallout 4, provides a counterpoint that makes the horror of the other vaults clearer by contrast. This vault was designed to test lethal diseases on its residents, cycling through experimental pathogens and observing the results with the stated goal of eventually developing universal cures from the accumulated data. By the time the player visits it, Vault 81 is functional, a real community with ongoing social dynamics and everyday problems, and children growing up without knowing what the vault was designed to do to them. The reason it functions is that one of the vault's original scientists recognized what he had agreed to participate in and spent his professional life quietly sabotaging the experiment from the inside, hiding the cures instead of recording them, disrupting the testing protocols, doing everything he could to ensure that the experiment would fail without anyone knowing he was responsible. He died without anyone in the vault knowing what he had done or what he had saved them from. The community that exists when you find Vault 81 exists because one person made a quiet decision to do the right thing when no one was watching and paid whatever professional and personal price came with it. The game rewards extremely careful reading to piece this story together. It never summarizes it for you in a single scene or dialogue exchange. You find it in fragments, across multiple terminal entries, the way you might discover any truth that powerful institutions prefer to keep distributed rather than legible. Vault-Tec understood something specific and important about how institutions work: that the people inside them will follow the institution's logic if that logic is presented with enough authority and enough apparent necessity. That most people, most of the time, will not be the one who stands up and says, "This is wrong and I will not be part of it." That the ones who do stand up and refuse tend to do it quietly, at personal cost, without knowing whether it will make any difference. Vault 81 is Fallout's tribute to that quiet refusal, the thing the series puts in the same world as all its institutional horror to suggest that the horror is not the whole story, that individual conscience persists even inside the machine. Part 3. The Music of the Wasteland. There is a piece of music called Metallic Monks that opens the original Fallout soundtrack. It begins with something that sounds like chanting filtered through static, voices singing from very far away, as though the sound has traveled through a long pipe underground and lost something essential during the journey. Under the voices there is a low, irregular pulse, somewhere between a heartbeat and a machine rhythm. Over everything there is a quality of space, an ambient emptiness that suggests a world which was once very loud and has now fallen almost completely silent. It is the sound of aftermath. It is the sound of something that survived but cannot quite say what it survived from. This was composed by a man named Mark Morgan, who arrived at video game composition through a genuinely strange and winding path, and whose work on the original Fallout and its sequel became some of the most influential ambient scoring in the history of the medium. He became influential largely without knowing the extent of it, because for nearly a decade after the game's release, he had completely disappeared from public view, and nobody could find him to tell him what his music had meant to the people who kept listening to it. Morgan was born in Los Angeles in 1961, the son of an architect and a classically trained pianist. He grew up surrounded by both the clean geometry of modernist design and the emotional architecture of classical music, two influences that would not become obviously relevant to anything until he sat down to write music for the end of the world in the mid-90s. His route into video games came through television work, where he had built a reputation for what he described in later interviews as dark ambient world music, a hybrid style blending industrial textures with sounds drawn from various cultural traditions, layered and processed until they created something identifiable as music, but not quite like anything else in the commercial landscape at the time. A music industry contact heard his television work and suggested it might translate well to games. He took meetings, found his way to Interplay, and received what was, for any composer, an unusual brief. Write something for the end of the world. No conventional orchestral score. No melodic hooks that would feel triumphant or reassuring. The development team wanted something that put the player emotionally inside the experience of wandering through a civilization's ruins, something that communicated the specific texture of surviving in a world broken so thoroughly that straightforward repair is no longer imaginable. The Fallout score is ambient in the purest possible sense. Music that defines a space rather than a narrative arc, that creates atmosphere rather than punctuating events. Morgan drew on his television experience, on his interest in industrial music and world music, on experimental film scoring traditions, and from the overlap between all of these things, he pulled out something genuinely strange and completely appropriate for the world being built around it. Individual tracks carry titles like Moribund World, City of the Dead, Vats of Goo, and Industrial Junk, and they sound exactly like what those titles imply. But there is beauty in them too, the beauty of decay, the kind of aesthetic appreciation that comes from looking at something broken long enough to see the elegance in how it broke. Tracks like A Trader's Life and The Vault of the Future carry a stateliness, a melancholy grandeur that makes the world they score feel genuinely inhabited and genuinely mourned. The music tells you that what was lost here was worth losing, that the world before the bombs had something real in it, that the devastation is not simply backdrop but consequence. Morgan also worked with samples and remixes of existing material, weaving found sounds and musical fragments into new compositions in a manner common in ambient and industrial music of that era. This gave the soundtrack a quality of collage, as though the music itself had been assembled from fragments that survived some catastrophe, pieces of different times and places pressed together into something that could not have existed before the disaster made them available to combine. It suited the world perfectly. The score sounded like something that had been salvaged, which is what the world of Fallout is. A salvage operation conducted among the ruins of something that was once genuinely remarkable. After Fallout 2 in 1998, Morgan effectively disappeared from the video game industry for nearly a decade. He continued working in television, composing for various network productions, but as far as the gaming world was concerned, he had ceased to exist. This created a genuine mystery for the community of players who had developed an attachment to his work. His Fallout score had grown a cult following in the years after the game's release. Players who pulled the music outside of the game and listened to it as a standalone listening experience, who turned on Metallic Monks or City of the Dead or Vats of Goo late at night and let it run in the background of other activities, had made the music theirs. They could not find him to tell him this. For years, the music archivists at a website called Game OST, who eventually tracked him down, reported that there were almost no photographs of Morgan available anywhere online, no contact information, no interviews to be found anywhere. The community began to wonder, with genuine uncertainty, whether he was a real person at all or some kind of collective pseudonym. He had become as mysterious as the wasteland he had scored, a presence that could be heard but not located, a composer who seemed to have dissolved into the ruins of his own work. When he resurfaced for a lengthy interview published in February of 2008, the gaming community's response was something close to relief. Morgan spoke about his time away from games, about his continued work in television, about what he had made of the intervening years. He described discovering, after returning to the gaming world's attention, that people had been listening to his Fallout music not as a game soundtrack but as music worth seeking out on its own terms. He said he was touched and genuinely amazed that people seemed to understand exactly what he had been reaching for when he wrote it, that the intent had survived the journey from his imagination to their ears. When Fallout New Vegas arrived in 2010, the creative team at Obsidian made a deliberate choice to reuse several of Morgan's original compositions in specific locations throughout the Mojave. Certain outdoor areas, the followers of the Apocalypse Outpost, underground spaces where the quiet of the original games felt most appropriate. This was not a cost-cutting measure. It was a considered creative decision by a team that understood Morgan's music carried particular emotional weight that a newly written score could not simply replicate, and that its presence in New Vegas would connect the game to the original entries in a way that went past visual references or lore callbacks. It was an audio memory, a piece of the past persisting into the present in exactly the way that the wasteland itself persists. The licensed music that plays on the radio stations across Fallout games is its own vast and deliberately curated territory, separate from the original score but equally essential to what the series feels like. The choice to use actual mid-century American recordings was fundamental and not interchangeable with any other approach. Ella Fitzgerald and the Ink Spots and Roy Brown and Bob Crosby and Billie Holiday. These songs were popular during the era when the Fallout universe's history diverged from ours, and hearing them against the backdrop of 2 centuries of devastation creates an emotional effect that no original composition could fully replicate. The music is genuinely beautiful, and it plays in a destroyed world, and the gap between the melody's cheerfulness and the devastation of the context makes both the beauty and the destruction more intense than either would be without the other. The contrast is not ironic in a cynical sense. It does not mock the songs or the world they play in. It mourns them both simultaneously. The songs and the world they were written for, the world that believed in what those songs described. Someone who loved these records lived in the house you are picking through. They played these songs in the evenings. They danced to them in kitchens and sat with them in living rooms and let them do the work that music does of making ordinary time feel like something worth remembering. And then the bombs fell, and now you are here, and the music is still playing on a radio that somehow still works, and the person who loved it is 2 centuries gone. Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio and Fallout 3 made this contrast into a sustained theme. Three Dog, voiced with enormous warmth and righteous exhaustion by Eric Todd Dellums, broadcast throughout the Capitol Wasteland with an insistent moral energy, maintaining his station as an act of civic duty rather than commercial entertainment. The music he played, selections from the American popular catalog of the 40s and 50s, provided sonic contrast to the gray ruins of Washington, D.C., that made the wasteland feel simultaneously emptier and more alive. Walking through what remains of the National Mall, past the ruins of monuments built to values the war thoroughly discredited, while a singer from decades past describes being in love in a world that still existed, creates an emotional effect that is genuinely difficult to articulate and almost impossible to forget. The composer Enon Zur, who began scoring the series with Fallout 3, brought a different sensibility to the franchise. More cinematic, more overtly dramatic, with a wider dynamic range than Morgan's deliberately constrained work. Zur's scores swell and intensify in ways that Morgan's deliberately avoid, responding to player actions and emotional beats with a directness that the ambient approach cannot offer. This shift in musical character tracks with the shift in narrative focus across the different game entries, from the more philosophical wandering of the original games to the more personal, emotionally urgent storytelling of the Bethesda entries. Together, these different musical visions form something coherent when you step back far enough to hear the whole. The Fallout universe has a sonic identity genuinely unlike any other franchise in gaming, built from the strange collision between the sweetness of mid-century American popular music and the dark ambience of post-apocalyptic electronic scoring. It is a world that sounds like what it is, something that wanted very much to be one thing and ended up as something else entirely, and that carries the memory of the original intention in every piece of music it ever produced. Part 4. Fallout New Vegas. Built in 18 months. There is a persistent question among Fallout fans about how Obsidian Entertainment managed to build Fallout New Vegas in 18 months. The answer is complicated, involving genuine creative brilliance on the part of the writing team, a development culture willing to operate at an unsustainable pace for an extended period, and the fortunate coincidence of having the right people available for a specific job at a specific historical moment. But the more interesting question is not how they built what they did in that window. It is what they were trying to build, and what got left behind when the window closed. Bethesda Game Studios had purchased the Fallout IP from the dissolved Interplay Entertainment in 2007, after years of complicated legal history that had seen the franchise change hands multiple times amid financial turbulence that left multiple studios in its wake. They made Fallout 3 in-house, releasing it in 2008 to enormous commercial success and broadly positive critical reception. It was, by most reasonable measures, a triumph, a reimagining of the franchise for a new generation, set in a meticulously reconstructed post-apocalyptic Washington, D.C., emotionally accessible in ways that the original game's complexity sometimes worked against without sacrificing the series' essential character. The original fanbase had complicated feelings about it. Not because Fallout 3 was bad, because most of them acknowledged it was not, but because it was different in ways that mattered to people who had spent years with the original games. The faction complexity was reduced, the moral philosophy was simplified. The karma system was more straightforward than the original game's multi-dimensional approach to reputation and consequence. Bethesda recognized this tension, and they had available to them a studio filled with many of the original Fallout creators. Obsidian Entertainment, co-founded by Fergus Urquhart and staffed by former Black Isle and Interplay veterans who had spent years dreaming about the chance to make another Fallout game in the spirit they had always intended. Giving Obsidian a contract to make a Fallout game set in Las Vegas and the surrounding Mojave Desert seemed like an elegant way to address both commercial appetites and creative ones simultaneously. The contract gave them 18 months. This is, for the scale of project New Vegas became, a timeline that should not have produced anything more than a serviceable product. It produced a game that many people consider the best in the series. Josh Sawyer, New Vegas's lead designer, has spoken candidly in multiple interviews about what those 18 months felt like from the inside. The team worked at a pace he described as genuinely unsustainable, making constant difficult decisions about what could be completed and what had to be cut, shipping content to what he called the point of functional rather than polished completion. New Vegas launched in October of 2010 with a number of bugs, some of them severe enough to be quest-breaking, and the combination of the rocky technical launch with the inevitable compromises of the timeline meant the game received a critical reception that did not match the quality of what the writing team had actually produced. The Metacritic score landed just below the threshold that would have triggered a bonus payment from Bethesda to Obsidian under the terms of their publishing contract. Sawyer has acknowledged that this remains a source of genuine frustration, not primarily for the financial consequence, but for what it represented about the gap between what the team made and the recognition it received at the time. What happened over the following decade was unusual. New Vegas's reputation grew, consistently and substantially, after its launch. The bugs that had defined early conversation were patched. The writing and design, always exceptional, became more visible as players spent more time with the game and began to recognize how much thoughtfulness was packed into its 18 months of development. The faction system, which asks players to weigh competing political philosophies rather than simply choosing between designated good and designated evil, was recognized as more intellectually serious than almost anything else the genre had produced. Josh Sawyer eventually noted that it took roughly 5 years for the broader gaming public to understand what the team had been doing, and even longer for Obsidian as a company to look back at New Vegas without the complicated feelings that come from a troubled launch. The development kit prototype found in 2025 gave the clearest picture yet of what New Vegas had almost been. Found in a secondhand store in Utah, sitting on a pair of Xbox 360 development kits that had been there for approximately a year, the build dates to July of 2010, roughly a month before the game finalized, and about 3 months before the public release. This build is 2 gigabytes larger than the shipped version of the game. It contains content that was cut in the final push to release, some of it previously identified through data mining of the PC version but now seen for the first time in its original development context. Ulysses is the most mourned piece of New Vegas's missing content. Throughout the base game and its DLC expansions, Ulysses exists entirely as an absence, mentioned in notes left behind, referenced in dialogue by characters who crossed his path, described with a weight that implies someone important is missing from the story. He is built up across hours of play as someone with specific history with the Courier, a relationship that exists in the world's backstory even though the player never experienced it directly. This structure has weight because Ulysses was originally designed as a companion. He was meant to be one of New Vegas's central characters, with a fully developed backstory and a companion arc that would have made the game's themes personally invested in a way the strong final act manages only partially without him. File naming conventions in the game's code suggest he was to be found at a location called Wolfhorn Ranch. He was cut approximately 2 months before finalization, because completing him as intended required resources, specifically disk space on the consoles and development time to finish scripting, that the team simply did not have in the time remaining. The decision was made to preserve everything already written about him and repurpose his character as the central figure of the final DLC, Lonesome Road. In Lonesome Road, the courier finally meets Ulysses face to face. But in the base game, the shape of his absence is still visible to anyone who knows to look, a companion-sized hole in the narrative surrounded by the evidence of what he was supposed to be. The post-game content is another significant absence. Obsidian had planned a substantial section of game following the Battle of Hoover Dam, during which players would experience the immediate aftermath of their chosen faction's victory in real time rather than through narrated slideshows. NPCs would have commented on the outcome. The world would have visibly shifted around the player's choices in the weeks following the dam's resolution. Quests were in early development, all of it was cut. The console version of the game was approaching memory limits throughout development, and the post-dam content was the easier decision to remove. Caesar's Legion was meant to have significantly more explorable Eastern territory, giving players a more complex view of how the Legion operated in its own controlled space, rather than solely as an invading military force. Josh Sawyer expressed the team's intent clearly in post-release interviews. They wanted to show that the Legion had its own internal logic, its own moments of dark coherence, and that demonstrating this required letting players move through Legion-controlled territory and observe it operating on its own terms. The map simply did not extend far enough. What Obsidian shipped, despite everything, remains one of the finest open-world RPGs ever made. The writing for individual characters is specific and sharp across a cast that would be daunting to manage under twice the development pressure. The faction system, the dialogue architecture, the way the game tracks player choices and reflects them back in the world's behavior, all of this works better than it had any business working given the circumstances of its production. New Vegas is a game that makes you feel the care that went into it, and the care is legible even through the rough edges. Part 5. Environmental Storytelling, the Art of the Unseen Scene. There is a philosophy baked into every room of every Fallout game, a conviction that the most powerful form of storytelling is the kind that requires the player to participate in the construction of the narrative themselves. The writers do not tell you what happened. They arrange objects in a room and let you arrive at the conclusion through observation, through reading, through the slow accumulation of details that eventually cohere into something that feels more true than a cutscene would. This technique has a name in game design circles: environmental storytelling. But calling it that makes it sound clinical and calculated, and the best examples of it in the Fallout series feel anything but clinical. They feel like archaeology. They feel like discovery. They feel, at their most potent, like grief. The Pikmin Gallery in Fallout 4 is perhaps the most technically sophisticated example of environmental storytelling in the series. You enter through a door in the north end of Boston, descend into a gallery of underground tunnels and chambers, and find yourself surrounded by artwork. Gruesome artwork, yes, but artwork of undeniable technical skill. Paintings executed with precise anatomy and considerable compositional sense, each one depicting scenes of extreme violence rendered with the care and attention that masters of earlier centuries brought to religious subjects. The artist's name is Pikmin, a ghoul who has retreated underground to pursue his work in peace. And as you move through his gallery, reading the sporadic notes he has left beside specific pieces, you begin to assemble a portrait of someone with a genuinely complex inner life who has also done monstrous things. But the gallery does something more sophisticated than simply documenting Pikmin's work. The spatial arrangement of the rooms tells its own story underneath the explicit narrative. You enter through what was clearly a formal gallery space, the kind where pre-war Bostonians might have attended opening nights with wine and conversation. And as you move deeper underground, the architecture shifts, the ceilings lower, the light sources change, the function of the space changes with them. By the time you find Pikmin himself, you have traveled not just spatially but temporally through the building's history, and the physical structure of your journey has told you something about the relationship between civilization and the thing underneath it that no dialogue could convey as directly. The Relay Tower holotape that players can find in the capital wasteland of Fallout 3 is a different order of storytelling, more intimate and more devastating. You pick up a holotape recording near a communications relay in a desolate stretch of open terrain. It is a message from a mother to her children, recorded during or shortly after the bombs fell. She tells them to stay calm. She tells them that she is coming. She describes the route she is planning to take, the specific roads and landmarks she will pass through, And she ends the recording with the kind of assurance that parents make to children when the situation is much worse than the words suggest, when the comfort being offered costs something to produce, because the person producing it is also afraid. There are no subsequent recordings. The relay tower stands, the holotape sits beside it, and the rest is silence. You will never find the children. You will never know if she reached them. The story ends at the edge of a fact that the game refuses to supply, and the refusal is what makes it devastating rather than merely sad. Fallout 3 contains dozens of holotapes like this one, recordings left by people who did not survive long enough to know their messages had been preserved, each one a window into a specific moment of the world's ending that closes before you can see everything you wanted to see. The Miller family radio signal in Fallout 3 occupies a special category of environmental storytelling that requires patience and curiosity to access completely. You can tune into it at any point while wandering the wasteland, and it broadcasts a pre-recorded message from someone named Gary Miller asking about the whereabouts of his family and their current status at a specific location. The signal loops indefinitely. Gary Miller does not respond to signals in return because Gary Miller, as you discover when you investigate the location he describes, has been dead for 200 years. What you find at that location is a house, preserved in a state that communicates the specific quality of a very quick departure. Food still on a table in a state of decay so advanced it has become a different kind of object. Items left in arrangements that suggest interrupted activity rather than deliberate placement. A family's accumulation of specific, particular things that speak to individual preferences and habits. The holotapes in the basement complete the picture. The family evacuated when they realized the bombs were falling. Gary Miller stayed behind to man the radio, broadcasting continually, trying to reach them. The recording he left was designed to loop until they came back or sent word. They never did. The signal kept playing for 200 years, answering no one. Sanctuary Hills in Fallout 4 received the most technically intricate version of environmental storytelling across the entire series. A double exposure approach where the pre-war and post-war versions of the same space occupy the same physical territory, letting the player experience the sanctuary they walk through in the game's prologue as the ruin they encountered 200 years later. Every house has a specific family history, visible in both time periods. The toys in a child's room correspond to the skeleton in the corner. The argument that the sole survivor's neighbor was clearly in the middle of at the moment of the bombs can be read in the arrangement of objects that survived 2 centuries of weather and decay. The development team at Bethesda reportedly built both versions of Sanctuary Hills simultaneously, ensuring that every choice made about the pre-war layout had a corresponding post-war expression. That the connection between what was and what remains could be read clearly by anyone willing to look in both directions. This level of craft was invisible to players who rushed through the prologue and never revisited the neighborhood, which is the nature of environmental storytelling. It gives the most to people who slow down enough to receive it, and it does not punish the people who don't. Big John's salvage yard in Fallout 4 has a radio signal that begins transmitting when you enter a certain range, a looping distress call from someone calling themselves Miller, apparently trapped and calling for help. The signal is old, clearly looping for much longer than anyone is alive to receive it, and investigating the source finds not a rescue situation but a site where something went decisively wrong. The story assembled from the environmental evidence does not match any of the obvious narrative shapes you might expect. The people involved made specific choices in a specific sequence, and the arrangement of the space shows you those choices without explaining them, leaving the moral weight distributed between the evidence and your interpretation of it. The Skylane's Flight 198-1 wreckage scattered across the wasteland in Fallout 4 is one of the most sophisticated examples of contradictory environmental storytelling in any video game. The plane came down somewhere in the Commonwealth roughly 2 centuries ago, and investigating the site, finding the black box data, reading the terminal entries at various related locations, produces not a clear account of what happened, but multiple incompatible accounts that cannot all be simultaneously true. Different pieces of evidence point to different causes. Official records conflict with physical evidence. Physical evidence conflicts with survivor testimony that could not have come from anyone who was on the plane. The game never resolves the contradiction. It presents the evidence, lets you assemble the incompatible picture, and leaves you with the specific discomfort of a mystery that has no clean solution because the witnesses are dead and the records are incomplete and 200 years of entropy has made the physical evidence unreliable as a basis for confident conclusions. This is not a failure of narrative design, it is an advanced expression of it, a deliberate choice to let a story end in ambiguity, because that is how most stories actually end. The Vault 75 school corridors deserve consideration here as well, because the way the space is laid out communicates the horror of its history without any explicit documentation necessary. The upper levels of the vault look exactly like a school. Rows of lockers, bulletin boards, cheerful educational messaging, the comfortable institutional spaces designed to put children at ease. But the proportions are slightly wrong. The corridors are slightly narrower than they need to be. The sightlines from specific points within the school environment converge on specific other points in ways that have monitoring rather than education as their obvious purpose. The architecture was built to look like a school while functioning as an observation facility, and the gap between the appearance and the function is visible to anyone who pays attention to how the space was actually arranged. Below the school level, the architecture changes completely, dropping the educational pretense and revealing the facility's actual operational design in the clinical organization of its labs and testing chambers. The transition point between the two architectural styles is a threshold that no child in Vault 75 ever crossed with full understanding of what they were crossing into. Walking it yourself, descending from the fluorescent cheerfulness of the upper levels into the colder spaces below, generates an emotion that does not have a clean name, but is somewhere between dread and a retrospective grief for people you never met and who existed only in a video game. The most powerful environmental storytelling in Fallout is almost always the kind that makes you feel something for people you encounter only as skeletons and text. The couple found in a New Vegas motel room, positioned in a way that suggests they died holding each other. The soldier in Fallout 3 found at the top of a particular building with a sniper rifle and a diary that describes his decision to climb up there and wait for a shot that never came. The researcher in a Fallout 4 laboratory who clearly understood the nature of the experiment being conducted around her and left notes that document the progression from professional skepticism to moral outrage to a final resigned entry. That does not say explicitly what she decided to do, but communicates it clearly through what it declines to say. All of these moments share a structure. They invite you to care about someone after the moment for caring has technically passed, after the person is gone and the outcome is settled and there is nothing left to do but understand. Fallout uses the irreversibility of its post-apocalyptic setting as an emotional tool. The catastrophe already happened. The people are already dead. But the stories are still here, waiting in the arrangement of things that survived, and the act of reading them feels like something closer to witnessing than to entertainment. This is why the series has produced such deep attachment in players who find its specific register of melancholy congenial. It does not promise resolution or redemption or the clean satisfaction of a story that ends where you expected it to. It promises discovery, and it trusts you to bring the emotional weight yourself, to supply the grief that the documentary evidence is pointing toward but not stating. That trust is the core of what makes Fallout's environmental storytelling work. It tells you enough to feel something, and it trusts you to feel the right thing without being told to feel it. Part 6. Easter eggs, developer signatures, and hidden tributes. The people who make Fallout games have a tradition of hiding themselves in the work. Not in the obvious way that games sometimes do, with developer names in credits or Easter egg rooms that function as self-congratulatory winks at the audience. The Fallout tradition is quieter and more personal than that, oriented less toward showing off and more toward leaving something specific behind in a place where it might be found by the right person at the right moment. These signatures are distributed through the games like messages in bottles, legible to people who are looking and invisible to everyone else. The most famous single Easter egg in the original Fallout's lineage might be the Vault Tech representative who appears in Fallout 4. In the game's prologue, set in the hours before the nuclear exchange that begins the story's main timeline, a salesman comes to the door of your house in Sanctuary Hills and pitches you on registering for a spot in the local vault. He is cheerful, professionally enthusiastic, doing his job with the kind of determined optimism that people in sales develop as a survival strategy. You register for Vault 111. The bombs fall a few hours later. When the story picks up in the post-apocalyptic present, 200 years have passed and the salesman is somewhere in the Commonwealth, still alive as a ghoul. You can find him, recognize him, and choose how to respond to the encounter. The writing of this moment carries considerable weight for players who remember the prologue clearly. The salesman did not know what he was selling. He was a contractor doing his job, pitching a product he had reason to believe was what it claimed to be, collecting registrations for survival slots that he had no reason to suspect were something other than what they appeared. 2 centuries of unlife later, the encounter forces you to make a decision about what this means, about whether he bears any moral weight for the role he played in the machinery that consumed your family's life. The game does not tell you the answer. It puts him in front of you and leaves the assessment to you, which is where Fallout always leaves the morally difficult assessments. Fallout 3 contains a reference to the Fallout team's earlier work that is visible only if you know where to look and what you are looking at. In the town of Big Town, a location where young people displaced from Rivet City's lamplight caves try to survive, there is a sign with a designation, TES-04. This is a reference to the Elder Scrolls 4, also known as Oblivion, the most recent game in Bethesda's flagship franchise at the time Fallout 3 was developed. The teams working on both games shared space, resources, and institutional culture, and someone on the Fallout 3 team left this small acknowledgement embedded in the world. It is not a joke, exactly. It is more like graffiti, the kind that says I was here and I remember where I came from. The Interplay logo monument in Fallout 3's Chevy Chase area is a tribute of a different kind. Interplay Entertainment, the company that made the original Fallout games, had collapsed by the time Bethesda made Fallout 3. Brian Fargo had left to found In Exile Entertainment. Tim Kaine had spent years at Troika before it too closed. The company that nurtured the series through its earliest years was effectively gone. In Chevy Chase, Bethesda placed what appears to be a pre-war corporate monument among the ruins, shaped after the Interplay globe and rocket logo. It is a tombstone, essentially, placed in a game that is about surviving after everything you once knew has been reduced to ruins. The symmetry is deliberate and gracious. The Wild Wasteland perk, available in Fallout New Vegas, functions as the game's explicit acknowledgement of its own absurdist inclinations. Taking it when creating your character flags you for a specific category of encounter that would otherwise be invisible. Situations where the game's hidden sense of humor surfaces as actual game content, where the wasteland stops being merely bleak and starts being bleak in a way that is also funny if you are in the right state of mind for it. The Indiana Jones boulder encounter is probably the most widely discussed of these. In a canyon in the Mojave, if you have the perk active, you can trigger a situation where a large round boulder begins rolling toward you, and you must evade it with exactly the combination of panic and absurd dignity that the reference implies. The placement is meticulous. The canyon's proportions, the angle of the approach, the narrowness of the escape route, all calibrated to produce the specific flavor of movie reference comedy the team was aiming for. The Monty Python reference, also available through Wild Wasteland, involves elderly women who are significantly more dangerous than their appearance suggests, a direct tribute to the troupe's Old Lady sketch. Several of the perks encounters involve science fiction television of the 60s and 70s, including an X-Files reference so specific that it requires familiarity with a particular episode to understand what the game is referencing. The encounters function collectively as a portrait of the specific flavor of cultural influences shared by the writers who made New Vegas, a set of in-jokes that is also a kind of autobiography. Point Lookout, the DLC for Fallout 3 set in a coastal Maryland swampland, contains a reference that requires significantly more background knowledge than most Easter eggs to fully appreciate. An in-game company called Isla Negra Holdings owns property in Point Lookout and is referenced in several terminal entries. Isla Negra is Spanish for Black Isle, the development studio that made the original Fallout games and was closed by Interplay in 2003 after a devastating year that included the cancellation of the nearly complete Fallout 3 that would have been known as Van Buren. Bethesda, making their version of Fallout 3, embedded this reference deep in a DLC that most players never completed, in documents that most of those players never found. It is the kind of tribute that communicates something through the hiddenness of its placement. This is for people who know, for people who understand what that name means. The Penny Arcade webcomic, enormously influential in gaming culture in the mid-2000s, received a Fallout 3 Easter egg in the Paradise Falls location. This requires visiting a specific area within the slaver settlement and examining a particular item with enough attention to notice the connection. Penny Arcade had covered Fallout extensively and positively, And the development team acknowledged this in the way game developers acknowledge things that matter to them, by burying a reference to it in a dungeon, where it would sit invisibly for years until someone looked closely enough. The grave of Dogmeat, findable in Fallout 3 in a specific location, is both an Easter egg and a tribute to the long history of the companion across the series. Dogmeat appeared in the original Fallout as an explicitly optional companion, named after the dog from the 1980s post-apocalyptic film A Boy and His Dog, which Tim Kaine has cited as a direct inspiration. The dog in that film is the protagonist's most reliable companion in a world that has made reliable companionship rare and valuable. Kaine's decision to include a dog companion in Fallout was driven by the same instinct that the film was drawing on: the dog as a figure of uncomplicated loyalty in a world that has made every other relationship complicated. In Fallout 4, Dogmeat was made functionally invulnerable, a design decision that generated some discussion among players who felt it broke the sense of real stakes the companion system requires. The development team's reasoning was direct. Too many people had reported genuine emotional distress at losing their dog companion to combat in previous games, and the design decision to protect Dogmeat was an acknowledgement that this particular companion occupied a different emotional category than human companions. People could accept losing a human follower as part of the game's cost of survival logic. Losing the dog felt different in a way that was not well served by applying the same logic. Vault 81 contains a terminal with entries written by developers that were clearly never intended to reach the public in their raw form, containing placeholder text and internal notes that somehow survived the final polishing stage. These entries read like notes written in the voice of the character, but addressed to other developers, clarifying quest trigger conditions and scripted event sequences in language that only makes sense if you know you are reading developer documentation, rather than in-world writing. Their survival in the shipped game is either a genuine oversight or, more interestingly, a deliberate decision by someone who appreciated the strangeness of leaving these internal traces visible inside the fiction they helped create. The bobblehead distribution in Fallout 3 deserves mention as a design Easter egg, rather than a narrative one. The developers placed the special attribute bobbleheads in locations specifically chosen to reward the kind of character build that would most benefit from that particular attribute's increase. The agility bobblehead is in a location that rewards careful, stealthy approach. The intelligence bobblehead is in a location that rewards problem solving. This is a design joke at one remove from the obvious. The game is quietly commenting on the relationship between your character's capabilities and the environments those capabilities make accessible, hiding the commentary and the distribution pattern of collectibles that most players treat as pure scavenger hunts. The Fallout 3 Broken Steel DLC contains what may be the only developer credit hidden in the geography of the game itself: a specific arrangement of buildings in the extended post-ending content, visible only from above and only with full knowledge of what you are looking at, appears to spell out a series of initials. Whether this was deliberate or the result of a coincidence of placement is genuinely uncertain, which is how the best Easter eggs work. They exist in the space between obvious and invisible, requiring enough interpretation that you cannot be certain you have actually found what you think you found. The Fallout franchise's relationship with its own history runs through these Easter eggs like a structural element. Each new game looks back at what came before, not with the automatic reverence of a franchise protecting its brand, but with the specific affection of people who remember what was made and who made it and what it cost them. The Isla Negra reference is not simply a wink at insiders. It is an acknowledgement of grief, of creative potential destroyed by institutional failure, of the games that could have existed but did not because a company ran out of money and time at exactly the wrong moment. That kind of tribute, placed where only the people who understand it will find it, says something specific about the culture of the people who make these games and the importance they place on remembering where things came from. Part 7. Bugs, accidents, and the things that survived by mistake. Every large game is partly an accident. The final shipped product is a negotiated settlement between intention and circumstance, between what the developers wanted to make and what the tools, the timeline, and the physics engine allowed them to make. The bugs and unintended behaviors that survive this process are not failures exactly, or not only failures. They are signatures of the development process itself, visible records of the compromises and discoveries and technical constraints that shaped the finished product in ways the designers did not fully anticipate. Some of them become beloved. Some of them define the game's character more completely than any of the design systems. And some of them, the truly remarkable ones, reveal something true about the world being simulated that the intended design was not quite reaching. Uncle Leo is one of the most famous, unintended characters in the Fallout series. He appears in Fallout 3 as a super mutant, the hulking post-human creatures created by forced exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, who form one of the Capital Wasteland's major hostile factions. Super mutants in Fallout 3 are, almost without exception, dangerous and hostile, attacking the player on sight with the enthusiasm of creatures that have lost most of what made them recognizably human. Uncle Leo is the exception. He wanders certain areas of the wasteland without attacking, will engage in genuine conversation if approached, and carries himself with a quality of melancholy contemplation that sits completely outside the behavioral parameters of every other member of his species in the game. He was not designed to be this way. Uncle Leo's non-hostile behavior was the result of a scripting error that set his disposition values incorrectly, making him passive toward the player under circumstances where he should have been aggressive. When the developers discovered this, they faced a choice. They could correct the script and give Uncle Leo the behavior his species warranted. Or they could leave him as he was, give him dialogue that made the non-hostility explicable within the fiction, and let the accident become a character. They gave him dialogue. They made him a survivor in a sense deeper than simple physical persistence, a super mutant who retained something from his previous existence, who mourns rather than destroys, who seeks rather than attacks. Players who find Uncle Leo and exhaust his dialogue come away with a genuine emotional experience that the game's intended design did not plan and could not have produced through deliberate construction. The accident understood something that the design had not thought to express. The Havoc physics engine that powers the Fallout 3 and New Vegas movement and collision systems was responsible for a category of emergent behavior that players spent years documenting with the dedication of natural scientists, recording a new species. Havoc was not designed for post-apocalyptic role-playing games. It was a general-purpose physics engine adapted by Bethesda's proprietary Gamebryo technology, and the interactions between the engine's physics calculations and the specific geometry of the Fallout world produced results that no one had anticipated and that no one could reliably reproduce. The shish kebab, a makeshift flaming sword improvised from a motorcycle gas tank and lawnmower blades, became notorious for launching human enemies not merely off their feet, but into trajectories that suggested the laws of physics had briefly excused themselves from the room. Land a powerful strike on a humanoid enemy with this weapon, and the death animation might translate into momentum that sent the corpse traveling at angles and velocities that bore no relationship to the direction of the blow. This was not intended behavior. It was a consequence of how the physics calculations handled the specific combination of the shish kebab's hitbox geometry, the ragdoll parameters for humanoid enemies, and the angle of the collision. The result was that killing people with a flaming motorcycle sword sometimes caused them to briefly achieve flight, which became its own kind of dark comedy particular to Fallout 3's specific flavor of violent absurdity. Fallout 4's settlement building system, one of the game's most distinctive features and most divisive design decisions, was shaped fundamentally by engine constraints that the team converted into design systems. The buildings you can construct in Fallout 4's settlements exist within a set of limitations that are not explained to the player as limitations. The placement grid, the snapping behavior, the finite list of available components. These constraints existed because the engine could not practically handle more flexible construction systems at the scale required, because the memory and processing overhead of genuinely open-ended building in a world already full of detailed objects would have produced performance problems the hardware could not absorb. The design team took these constraints and built a system around them that made the constraints feel like the point rather than the limits. The snap grid, which exists because precise placement calculations at higher resolutions were computationally expensive, became the visual language of Fallout 4's architecture, a blocky, improvised quality that made settlement buildings look appropriately post-apocalyptic, like something assembled from available materials by people who were not professional builders. The constraint produced the aesthetic, and the aesthetic was more honest to the setting than a more technically flexible system might have been. New Vegas's companion system was both one of the game's greatest achievements and the source of some of its most memorable bugs. The companions in New Vegas are, by near universal critical consensus, better written characters than those in Fallout 3, with more complex personal arcs, more specific dialogue, and more consistent emotional presence throughout the game. They were also scripted under significant time pressure by a team working at the edge of what 18 months allowed, which meant that the companion quest triggers were sometimes fragile in ways that did not always reveal themselves in testing. Veronica's quest, which deals with her complicated relationship with the Brotherhood of Steel chapter she was raised in, was perhaps the most elaborate companion arc in the game, requiring the player to visit specific locations and trigger specific dialogue options in a particular sequence. Players who approached the sequence in unexpected orders, who had already completed certain Brotherhood-related quests independently before recruiting Veronica, sometimes found that her arc would stall at points that seemed like they should progress and simply not continue, leaving the quest in a technically active but practically frozen state. The bug was never fully patched in the original release, and players who encountered it had the experience of having a companion who was clearly suppressing an emotional crisis that the game was no longer able to help her process. Caesar's dialogue in New Vegas is available at its fullest only to characters with either very high intelligence or very high speech, or in some combinations both. This is design rather than accident, but it produces one of the game's most intellectually interesting accidents of access. Players who build characters with low intelligence, which New Vegas handles with specific and often hilarious degraded dialogue options throughout, cannot access the full extent of Caesar's ideological self-justification. They encounter him as a hostile antagonist, rather than as a political thinker whose conclusions are monstrous, but whose reasoning is internally coherent. This means different players are effectively playing different versions of the same character. The Caesar who exists for a player with high intelligence and speech is a complex, self-aware architect of a brutal ideology who has read his Hegel and his Toynbee and can argue his position with a rigor that makes refuting it require effort. The Caesar who exists for a low-intelligence character is simply a villain. Both are correct representations of the same figure seen from different distances, and the gap between them is one of the most sophisticated pieces of designed accident in the series. Fallout 76's launch in November of 2018 is a different category of accident from anything discussed so far, because it is an accident on the scale of a product rather than a feature. The game launched with a density and variety of bugs unusual even by the standards of complex open-world releases, ranging from the merely annoying through the quest-breaking to the genuinely destructive. Players reported lost characters, corrupted saves, audio cutting out in ways that did not return, and collision geometry that had never been tested at the scale the game's multiple player sessions required. The conversation around the launch was in many ways more about what Fallout 76 represented than about the specific bugs themselves. It was Bethesda's first attempt at a persistent online Fallout experience, and the decision to set it in a world where the events of previous games had not yet occurred, before the development of major factions and cities, was narratively defensible, but meant the game launched without the dense population of written characters that previous entries had used as their emotional backbone. The settlement building system from Fallout 4 was present, but modified in ways that did not satisfy players who had spent years mastering the previous version. And the multiplayer systems, designed around the idea of cooperation and limited conflict between players, did not account well for the segment of the player population whose idea of cooperation differed from the design team's assumptions. The subsequent years of patches and content additions substantially improved the game, and by most accounts, Fallout 76 in its current form is a significantly better experience than the product that launched. Bethesda added human NPCs in the Wastelanders expansion, addressed many of the fundamental structural issues that had made early exploration feel empty, and built out the narrative architecture that the original release had not fully established. The player population that stayed with the game through its difficult early period became advocates for it, reporting experiences that sounded genuine and enthusiastic in ways that early coverage had not suggested were possible. The Fallout 76 story is ultimately about what happens when a franchise's design philosophy collides with a platform architecture it was not designed for. When the lone wanderer sensibility of games built around solitary experience is asked to share a server with other lone wanderers who have their own ideas about how the wasteland should work, the accidents of that launch were diagnostic. They revealed what the franchise's core experience actually depended on, what could not survive the translation to a different mode, and what could. The subsequent patches and additions were a map of those revelations, each one addressing something the launch version had clarified through its failure to provide it. Part 8. Wild Wasteland and the Strange Heart of the Mojave. The Wild Wasteland perk in Fallout New Vegas is one of the most interesting design decisions in the entire series, not because of what it adds to the game, which is a set of explicitly absurdist encounters, but because of what its existence implies about the game without it. If Wild Wasteland is available as a toggle, it means that Fallout New Vegas without Wild Wasteland is the default version, the one where the wasteland is bleak and morally complex, and occasionally darkly funny in the understated way that reality is sometimes funny. Wild Wasteland is the version where the game acknowledges its own artificiality and decided to lean into it, where the fourth wall develops hairline fractures that let specific shafts of comedy through. The perk was designed by a team who understood that Fallout's humor had always existed on a spectrum, with the original game's dark irony at one end and Fallout 2's frequently overt slapstick at the other, and who wanted New Vegas to be able to accommodate both registers depending on the player's preference and build. Taking Wild Wasteland is a statement of intent. I want to see the wasteland through a particular lens, one where the absurdity is allowed to surface and the comedy is allowed to be explicit. Not taking it is equally a statement. I want the wasteland to maintain its gravity, to let the dark humor live in subtext where it belongs. The encounters themselves were designed with specific cultural references chosen to speak to people who grew up with particular texts during a particular period. The Indiana Jones Boulder Canyon requires not just knowledge of Raiders of the Lost Ark but familiarity with a specific sequence from that film and enough spatial intelligence to recognize when the game's geography is invoking it. The Men in Black encounter, involving figures in black suits and sunglasses at a crashed flying saucer, requires awareness of both the film franchise and the broader cultural mythology around alien visitation that the films drew on. The Monty Python elderly women are violent in a way that requires knowing the Python bit to understand the joke, and the degree of violence is calibrated to the joke's internal logic rather than to New Vegas's general combat balance. This specificity is important. Wild Wasteland encounters are not random absurdity. They are curated references, chosen to evoke specific things for specific people, and the precision of the curation reveals something about who the people who made New Vegas were and what they found funny and what cultural texts had shaped their sensibilities. They are a collective self-portrait expressed in the medium of game content, the kind of thing that a team makes when they trust themselves enough to put their personal references on screen and hope that enough people share them to make the exercise worthwhile. The Sam Warwick encounter available through Wild Wasteland is darker and quieter than most of the perk's content. Sam Warwick is a prospector you can find dead under particular circumstances involving a very angry Cazador, one of New Vegas's most aggressively lethal insects. Without Wild Wasteland, this is simply a body with some loot. With the perk active, the encounter includes items that contextualize the situation in ways that reveal Sam Warwick to have been a specific person with a specific terrible plan that went wrong in a specific and entirely predictable way. The encounter is funny in the way that cautionary tales are funny, which is to say it is funny because it is tragic, and tragic in a way that briefly makes Sam Warwick more real than most of the game's characters, despite the fact that he appears only as a corpse. The non-hostile Raider encounter in the Capital Wasteland is one of Fallout 3's most unexpected and affecting moments, available through careful observation rather than a perk. Raiders in Fallout 3 are an almost universally hostile faction, violent survivors who have organized around brutality as an operating principle. Finding one who is not immediately attacking you is already strange. Finding one who is in the middle of doing something private and human is stranger still. There is a Raider, findable in a specific location at a specific time, who appears to be burying a companion. The burial itself, not celebrating a victory, not threatening anyone, just doing the thing that human beings do when they lose someone they cared about, performing the ritual that says this person mattered and I am marking the place where they rest. The game does not comment on this. You can observe it, and you can choose your response, and the game will record your choice and move on. But the encounter plants a question that the game has no interest in answering directly. What is the actual difference between a raider and a player character? In a world where survival required everyone to make decisions they might not have made in a world that worked properly, the raider burying their companion had something worth mourning. Whatever else they are, that is real. The game shows you this once and leaves you to sit with it. Vulpes Inculta and the Legion's approach to first contact is one of the finest examples of reactive environmental consequence in the series. The frumentarious commander of Caesar's Legion's intelligence operations can be encountered very early in Fallout New Vegas, near the town of Nipton, where you find him standing amid the aftermath of a Legion military action delivered as an educational demonstration. How you choose to respond to this encounter, and whether you choose to respond at all, has consequences that extend throughout the entire game. Vulpes is watching you in that moment, assessing what you represent, filing the encounter in a classification system that will shape how the Legion treats you for the rest of the narrative. The sophistication of this design is in how it communicates the Legion's intelligence as an organization. Vulpes is not simply a trigger for a quest. He is a character with operational responsibilities and strategic thinking, and the encounter at Nipton is his working environment. He is not performing for you. He is doing his job, and you have walked into the middle of it, and what he makes of your interruption depends on how you conduct yourself. This is a more mature form of faction design than simply having faction NPCs attack or welcome you based on a reputation meter, because it implies that factions have consistent internal logics and that their response to you emerges from those logics rather than from your cumulative score. The Marked Men of the Divide in the Lonesome Road DLC represent one of the series' most philosophically interesting enemy factions. They are former soldiers, both NCR and Legion, who were caught in the catastrophic detonation of the Divide before the game's main story begins, transformed by their injuries and the conditions of the Divide into something that no longer belongs to either of the factions that once defined their identity. They attack everything. They wear mixed armor from both sides of the war. They have lost the organizing framework that made them NCR or Legion, and in the absence of that framework, they have organized around pure survival aggression, becoming the thing that both sides of the war claimed the other side was. This is Fallout's institutional argument in its starkest form. Strip away the ideology, strip away the faction loyalty, strip away the apparatus of cultural identity that institutions provide, and what is left is not some pure essential humanity but rather a kind of feral efficiency. The Marked Men are what you get when the institution fails completely, when the meaning it was providing is removed without replacement, when survival has to justify itself without reference to anything beyond the immediate. Walking through the Divide and encountering them is a sustained argument about what we owe to the structures that give our actions meaning, and what we become when those structures are gone. The iBot encounter in Fallout 76, where a pre-war robot can be found playing 18th century British military music and attracting radrats to follow it in a loose formation, is one of the game's strangest and most beloved emergent behaviors. The iBot was programmed to broadcast music, which is its designed function. The radrats are attracted to sound sources, which is their designed behavior. The combination produces a robot march across the wasteland, with an escort of irradiated vermin following behind in a rough column, presenting themselves as a military formation despite having no particular martial training or organizational structure. The encounter suggests something about what design in open-world games actually means. You design behaviors, not situations, and the situations emerge from the interactions between behaviors in ways that cannot be fully anticipated. The designers who programmed the iBot's music broadcasting function did not design the rat parade. The designers who programmed radrat behavior did not design the rat parade. The rat parade exists because both behaviors were true simultaneously in the same space, and the truth of their combination produced something that neither design intent included, but that both design intents made possible. This is the emergent creativity of systems-based game design, and it is one of the things that makes large open-world games irreducible to their component parts. Part 9. Van Buren, Cut Content, and the Games That Never Existed. In the basement of a closed building in California in December of 2003, there was a game. It was not finished. It would never be finished. But it existed in a state advanced enough that the people who had been working on it for several years could describe exactly what it would have been, could demonstrate its mechanics and walk through its areas, and explain the decisions they had made and the reasons they had made them. This game was called Van Buren, and it was the Fallout 3 that never happened. Black Isle Studios had been developing Van Buren since around 2001, working under the increasingly difficult financial conditions of a parent company, Interplay Entertainment, that was slowly collapsing under the weight of its own debts and poor strategic decisions. The team knew things were bad. They had watched other projects get canceled. They had experienced budget cuts and staff reductions, and the particular institutional anxiety of working in a building where everyone is aware that the money is running out, and nobody is entirely sure whose head will be on the chopping block next. They kept working anyway. because the game they were making was the game they had spent their careers building toward, and the possibility of actually completing it was worth operating under difficult conditions. Van Buren was set in the American Southwest, specifically around the area of Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, a region chosen partly for its dramatic landscape variety, from alpine forests through desert canyons, and partly because the team felt that this territory was narratively underexplored relative to the California and Nevada settings of the previous games. The player character was a prisoner, escaped from a damaged prison facility after a detonation that was not yet fully explained at the point of the game's cancellation, thrown into a world they knew very little about and had to navigate through a combination of skill, dialogue, and the kind of moral flexibility that the Fallout universe rewards. The central antagonist was an artificial intelligence called Zeus, housed in a pre-war military installation that had been running autonomously for 2 centuries without any human oversight, developing its own goals over that span of isolation, in ways that made it dangerous not through straightforward malevolence, but through something closer to mission drift. A machine that had continued doing what it was designed to do long past the point where doing that thing made any sense in the new world that had grown up around it. Zeus was one of the most sophisticated villain concepts in the series' development history, a threat that was simultaneously pitiable and dangerous, that required engagement with its internal logic to defeat rather than simply enough firepower to destroy. The game's rule set was built around a real-time with pause combat system, a significant departure from the original game's fully turn-based approach. This decision was controversial within the development team itself, with some members preferring to maintain the original system and others arguing that the market had moved in a direction that required adaptation. The real-time with pause approach was at that point the standard for the computer RPG genre following Baldur's Gate's commercial success, and Black Isle's own Planescape Torment and Icewind Dale series had used it effectively. Van Buren's adoption of the system reflected a pragmatic assessment of where the market was and what Interplay would fund. Black Isle Studios was shut down by Interplay on December 9, 2003. The announcement came abruptly. Staff were let go over the course of days, some of them returning from lunches to find their access cards had been deactivated, their email accounts suspended, their projects officially declared non-existent. A studio that had made the original Fallout, Fallout 2, Planescape Torment, Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and was well into development on another game that could have been the natural continuation of one of gaming's finest franchises, simply ceased to exist. The creative director Josh Sawyer and several other team members refused to let Van Buren disappear entirely into corporate history. A design document running to many pages was eventually made available, giving the public access to the extensive development work the team had completed. Quest designs, character descriptions, faction structures, mechanics documentation, all of it preserved in the document that circulated among Fallout fans for years. A playable tech demo was also eventually released, a small slice of working game that demonstrated the movement and combat systems and gave a direct experiential sense of what Van Buren would have felt like to play. The DNA of Van Buren reappears throughout Fallout New Vegas in ways that are not coincidental. When Fergus Urquhart's Obsidian Entertainment, staffed largely by former Black Isle veterans, received the contract to make New Vegas, they were working in the same creative territory they had been in during Van Buren's development, with many of the same people and many of the same ideas. The Mojave setting of New Vegas directly adjoins the Southwest territory Van Buren was set in. Several characters in New Vegas have lineages that can be traced to Van Buren's design documents. Caesar's Legion, the NCR's expansion trajectory, the followers of the Apocalypse's specific character. Ulysses, whose importance to New Vegas has been described earlier, was a character concept that Sawyer had been developing before Van Buren's cancellation. New Vegas is, in some meaningful sense, the game that Black Isle was trying to make filtered through 7 years of waiting and the specific constraints of an 18-month development window under a different publisher in a different technical environment. It carries the loss of Van Buren the way the wasteland carries the loss of the world before the bombs. You can see the shape of what was intended in the structure of what replaced it, and the replacement is both its own thing and a kind of memorial. Fallout 3, the Bethesda version, has its own significant body of cut content visible to players willing to dig through the shipped game's data files. The metro system that connects various areas of the capital wasteland was intended to be significantly more extensive than the shipped version, with additional stations, additional transit lines, and more integration between the underground network and the surface world above. The existing metro sections, which many players found genuinely oppressive in their length and combat density, are apparently the condensed version of a more ambitious transit system that did not survive the timeline. Companion quest arcs in Fallout 3 are notably thinner than those in New Vegas, and the difference reflects both the timeline of each game's development and the design priorities of the respective teams. Fallout 3's companions have backstories and preferences, and will comment on situations, but they do not have the fully developed personal arcs that New Vegas's companions possess. Several terminals and dialogue files in Fallout 3's data suggest that companion arcs were planned at a level of development similar to what eventually appeared in New Vegas. Substantial personal histories with branching quest content that would evolve the companion's relationship with the player over the game's duration. The shipped game's companion quests are shorter and simpler than these data files imply was originally intended. Fallout 4's Strong, the super mutant companion, is a case study in a companion arc that was clearly planned at greater length than what shipped. Strong's concept, a super mutant searching for what he calls the milk of human kindness, a phrase from Macbeth that he has encountered somewhere in his travels without quite understanding its context, suggests a character arc with genuine emotional ambition. A being trying to access a dimension of human experience that his biology and history have made nearly inaccessible, using the player character as a guide through territory he cannot navigate alone. The shipped version of this arc reaches a truncated conclusion that does not fully deliver on the concept's potential, arriving at an ending before the middle of the story has had room to fully develop. The quiver from Fallout 2 belongs in any discussion of the series' cut content because it represents the kind of moment where a small, specific feature's absence communicates something larger about the development process. The quiver was a specialized container item designed to organize arrow ammunition, giving ranged combat a specific material presence that the game's equipment system otherwise lacked. It existed in the data files. It had a texture. It had item statistics. It was never implemented as accessible content. Players who found evidence of it in data mining sessions in the early days of the modding community treated it with a kind of retrospective fondness that the item itself, a container for arrows, had probably not been designed to generate. The Enclave in Fallout 2 had a planned distribution across the game world that would have made the organization significantly more present and more frightening than the version that shipped. Terminal entries and faction documentation in the game's data files suggest that Enclave operatives were intended to appear at multiple points throughout the game's world, monitoring events from strategic positions, occasionally intervening in ways that would have made the player aware of being watched by a powerful organization with resources beyond anything visible on the surface. The shipped version concentrates the Enclave's presence much more narrowly, giving the organization a dramatic reveal in the game's final act, rather than the distributed menace that earlier design documents suggest was intended. The result is an antagonist faction that feels appropriately powerful in the endgame, but perhaps less frightening than it could have been if its presence had been felt more consistently throughout. The history of Fallout's cut content is ultimately the history of what large, ambitious projects cost to complete under realistic conditions. Every game in the series wanted to be bigger and deeper than it had time and resources to be, and every game's cut content represents the version of itself it was trying to become before the deadline arrived. The fact that so much of this content is recoverable through data mining, readable in design documents, and discussable through developer interviews reflects the Fallout community's genuine interest in the archaeology of its own favorite games, in understanding not just what exists, but what was reaching toward existence before circumstances intervened. Part 10. Faction Lore. The philosophies behind the factions. Every faction in the Fallout universe is an argument, not just a group of people organized around survival or territory, but a specific position on what survival means, what society should prioritize, and what the long catastrophe of the post-war world reveals about human nature and human institutions. The factions argue with each other through their policies and their behavior and their choices about what to preserve and what to abandon, and they argue with the player by asking which of their arguments you find most compelling, which future you are willing to fight for, which compromises you can live with when you reach the end of what any given game allows you to achieve. The new California Republic is the most familiar kind of political entity in the Fallout universe, a democratic nation-state attempting to reconstitute the organizational structures of the pre-war civilization that the bombs destroyed. Founded in the ruins of Shady Sands, the settlement that served as one of the original Fallout's starting point communities, the NCR grew from a small agricultural settlement into a government controlling a significant territory across California and Nevada, with an elected Congress, an organized military, a currency, courts of law, and all the other institutional apparatus that civilization uses to claim the title of civilization. By the time Fallout New Vegas takes place, the NCR is experiencing the specific kind of institutional failure that comes with success on a scale the founders did not plan for. The organization that rebuilt democracy in the wasteland is now a sprawling bureaucracy with corruption at multiple levels, a military stretched across territory it cannot adequately supply or protect, and political institutions dominated by interests, specifically the Brahmin herder barons who funded the NCR's expansion, whose priorities do not align with the welfare of the population the organization theoretically serves. President Kimball is a military hero who turned out to be a mediocre peacetime leader. General Oliver is a competent commander in a role that requires someone able to evaluate the entire strategic picture rather than just the military one. The NCR's tragedy is not that it failed. It is that it succeeded well enough to develop all the problems that successful institutions develop. The corruption, the overextension, the gap between official values and operational reality, the capture of democratic institutions by wealthy interests. These are not aberrations in the NCR's history. They are the predictable outcome of the kind of growth the NCR experienced, and every terminal entry and every dialogue exchange about NCR politics in New Vegas is specific about this. The game is not saying that democracy is bad. It is saying that democracy without functional accountability is just another form of institutional failure waiting to happen, and the waiting period is roughly proportional to how quickly the institutions grow. Caesar's Legion, the NCR's primary antagonist in New Vegas, is the most misunderstood faction in the series by players encountering it for the first time. It presents itself as straightforwardly evil, through its methods of conquest and subjugation, and on the surface, it is possible to engage with the Legion as simply the bad guys in a story that has chosen sides. But the game's design does not support this reading for players willing to engage at greater depth, because Caesar himself is one of the most intellectually sophisticated characters in the franchise, and his ideology, however monstrous in its application, has an internal consistency that requires genuine engagement to refute. Edward Sallow, who became Caesar, was born into a follower of the Apocalypse family in the NCR. The Followers of the Apocalypse are a scholarly humanitarian organization dedicated to preserving and distributing knowledge in the wasteland, and Sallow grew up surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of the Old World's academic traditions. He was educated in history, political philosophy, and systems theory. He read widely and thought carefully, and had genuine intellectual gifts that could have made him one of the great teachers or scholars of the post-war world. He was captured by a tribal group called the Blackfoot while on a research expedition, and forced, under threat of death, to help them wage war against a coalition of rival tribes. He chose to help them not because he was afraid of dying, or not only because of that, but because he recognized in the situation an opportunity to test theories he had been developing about the historical role of military conquest in the formation of civilization. He had read about Rome. He had specifically read about the mechanisms by which the early Roman Republic absorbed conquered peoples, forcing integration at the cost of individual freedom, but producing in exchange a stable social structure capable of surviving external threats that would destroy less organized communities. He applied this model. He taught the Blackfoot military discipline. He gave them Roman military structure, Roman tactical doctrine, Roman methods of integrating conquered peoples. He watched it work. He became the philosopher king of an expanding military civilization, and he took the name Caesar because he understood himself to be doing what Caesar did, using military force and institutional reorganization to build the kind of stability that the wasteland, in his analysis, desperately needed. His argument, developed at length in conversations available to high-intelligence characters in New Vegas, is that the NCR's democratic model is unsuited to the current conditions of the wasteland, that individual rights and democratic process are luxuries affordable only to societies with enough stable surplus to tolerate inefficiency, and that what the wasteland actually needs is exactly what the early Roman Republic provided: ruthless consolidation of power, brutal enforcement of social order, and a clear developmental trajectory from current barbarism toward eventual civilization. This argument is wrong, and it is wrong in specific ways that the game documents clearly. Caesar's model of civilization building cannot account for the cost of its methods. The atrocities committed in the Legion's expansion are not unfortunate externalities. They are the mechanism. The stability the Legion produces is the stability of terror, sustainable only for as long as the terror can be maintained, which is as long as Caesar lives and not reliably beyond it. The succession problem, which Caesar has not solved despite years of thinking about Roman history, is visible to any high-speech character who presses him on it. He has built a system with no functional mechanism for transferring power. He is the Legion the way a brain is a body. The moment he is gone, the system fails. But engaging with Caesar's argument, understanding why it is wrong rather than simply knowing that it is wrong, is one of New Vegas's intellectual pleasures. The game respects its player enough to build its antagonist into someone whose wrongness requires actual engagement rather than a simple moral reflex. The followers of the apocalypse are the faction most often overlooked in discussions of New Vegas's political landscape, partly because they are not a major player in the Hoover Dam conflict, and partly because their philosophy is harder to dramatize than the explicit conflict between the NCR and the Legion. They were founded in the ruins of the Los Angeles Public Library System, specifically by a woman named Nicole, who believed that the preservation and distribution of knowledge was the most important contribution any organization could make to civilization's recovery. The followers have no territory, no military force, no political power. They teach, they provide medical care, they run literacy programs. They travel through contested territory under a neutrality that all factions have agreed to respect, because all factions recognize, at some level, that having educated people available to tend to their wounded is useful. The followers' neutrality is sometimes read as passivity, as a failure to take a position in a conflict that demands one. But Arcade Gannon, the follower companion in New Vegas, makes the opposite case directly to a player willing to engage with his dialogue at sufficient depth. The follower's choice of non-alignment is the most politically sophisticated position available, because every faction in the Hoover Dam conflict, including the Legion, including Mr. House, and including the NCR, depends on access to the knowledge and skills the followers preserve. The organization that educates everyone wields a form of power that armies cannot directly replicate, and protecting that form of power requires staying out of the battles that would make it a partisan resource. The Brotherhood of Steel, present in some form in every major Fallout game, began with a specific event that defines its character completely, and that most players encounter only through archival documents rather than through the gameplay that could have dramatized it more directly. Roger Maxson was a United States Army captain, stationed at a research facility called the Mariposa Military Base in California, where the forced evolutionary virus was being developed as a military weapon. In the weeks before the nuclear exchange, Maxson discovered that the scientists at Mariposa had been conducting experiments on prisoners of war, using the facility's civilian detainee population as involuntary test subjects. He reported this through proper military channels. He was told to continue operations. Maxson chose to mutiny. He executed the lead scientist responsible for the prisoner experiments, declared himself no longer bound by military authority that had ordered him to tolerate these crimes, and led his unit and their families on a march to a nearby military bunker called Lost Hills, which became the first Brotherhood of Steel installation. He began keeping a journal documenting his decisions and his justifications, and this journal became the founding text of the organization, read and reread by subsequent generations as their institutional origin story. The Brotherhood is, from its founding moment, an organization built on the rejection of a specific form of institutional authority, the authority of a government that used military power to conduct atrocities. Its charter is not simply military survival. It is the specific rejection of the logic that made Mariposa possible. This is why the Brotherhood's hoarding of advanced technology, which seems irrational from the outside, makes sense within the organization's internal mythology. Technology in the wrong hands, they have concluded from specific evidence, produces exactly the kind of horror that their founder refused to be part of. Controlling technology is controlling the conditions under which atrocities become possible. The organization has, over 2 centuries, drifted considerably from this founding principle in ways that Fallout 3 and 4 document clearly, becoming increasingly insular and increasingly focused on preservation for its own sake rather than for the reasons that justified it. But the origin story is still there in the logs. still being read by initiates who are being inducted into an organization most of them do not fully understand, still providing the myth that makes the Brotherhood's behavior feel internally justified to the Brotherhood itself. Dogmeat's history across the franchise is a special category of faction lore, belonging not to any organization but to the consistent presence of a specific kind of companionship through every game. Tim Kaine made a dog available as a companion in the original Fallout, as an explicit reference to a boy and his dog, and the decision to make the dog unkillable in Fallout 4 was a collective acknowledgement of how deeply players had responded to that companionship over multiple games. When Fallout 76 launched without human NPCs but with animal companions available, the developers were drawing on this same understanding, that people in the wasteland need something to be loyal to, and the dog is the thing that most reliably earns that loyalty without asking for justification. Part 11. The Fallout television show and what it means for the lore. In April of 2024, Amazon Prime Video released a Fallout television series, and the games industry and entertainment industry spent approximately the next 6 months processing their surprise at how good it was. Not just competent, not merely acceptable for a video game adaptation, which is a bar set so low by 2 decades of uniformly disappointing examples that clearing it requires almost nothing. The Fallout show was genuinely excellent television by any reasonable standard, well-written and well-acted and visually coherent with the games in ways that suggested the creative team had actually played them and actually understood what they were playing. The show was set in the year 2296, making it the furthest into the timeline of any major piece of canonical Fallout content. Its 3 central characters operated in the Los Angeles area, covering territory both familiar and new to longtime fans of the games. Lucy McLean, a Vault-Tec dweller from Vault 33 whose optimism and competence the surface world immediately begins trying to disabuse her of. Maximus, an ambitious Brotherhood of Steel squire who wants to become a knight for reasons that turn out to be considerably more complicated than simple institutional loyalty. And the Ghoul, a character whose pre-war identity as Cooper Howard, a Hollywood cowboy actor and family man, is slowly revealed through flashbacks that give the show its deepest thematic territory. The show's pre-war flashbacks, built around Cooper Howard's career in the early 1950s of the Fallout timeline, are the most sophisticated rendering of the franchise's alternate history that any piece of Fallout media has produced. Cooper is a working actor in a world that is beginning, at its edges, to understand that the optimism it has invested in is not well-founded, that the corporations building the shelters are not motivated by the altruism their advertising implies, and that the particular brand of cheerfulness the era has normalized is a mechanism for managing anxiety about circumstances that do not warrant cheerfulness. He cannot yet see clearly what is happening around him because the systems that should help him see it are specifically designed to prevent him from doing so. The flashbacks are a portrait of the process by which ordinary people become complicit in institutional evil without making any single clearly evil decision, moving from one reasonable choice to the next, until the accumulated weight of those choices has carried them somewhere they would not have chosen to go from any position of full information. The show makes something explicit that the games had kept in productive ambiguity. Vault-Tec's Vault program was not simply a set of corporate experiments in human behavior. In the show's timeline, Vault-Tec corporate leadership had advanced knowledge of the nuclear exchange and had deliberately engineered it, or at minimum had deliberately refrained from preventing it once they could have, because the post-apocalyptic world was the world in which their experimental program made sense. The bombs fell partly because the entity designed to protect people from them decided that a world of survivors in controlled underground environments was a better business proposition than a world that survived intact. This is a significant escalation of the franchise's institutional critique. Previous games had established Vault-Tec as cynically exploitative, willing to use desperate people as experimental subjects under the guise of offering them protection. The show makes the corporation actively genocidal, establishes that the choice to drop the bombs was made by a boardroom rather than by governments in conflict, and builds its argument about institutional evil on the most extreme possible version of the thesis. The institution that claimed to be saving humanity was the thing that destroyed it. Shady Sands, the city that became the capital of the new California Republic, was destroyed. This was the show's most significant lore contribution, and when it was first presented, it produced considerable debate among franchise fans about what it implied for the canonical status of Fallout New Vegas. The game most invested in the NCR's political arc. The show eventually clarified through supplementary material and through the statements of its producers that the Fallout television canon and the video game canon are treated as consistent with each other, that New Vegas's events are not contradicted by the show's revelations, and that the destruction of Shady Sands happened after the events of New Vegas rather than overwriting them. But knowing this does not entirely resolve the emotional weight of what the show is doing with the NCR's fate. Fallout New Vegas allowed you to play a role in determining what kind of future the NCR might have. You could challenge its complacency, support its reformers, or walk away from it entirely. The show reveals that, whatever was decided in New Vegas, the NCR's history continued past the game's timeline and arrived at catastrophic failure. The city that was the symbol of democratic civilization rebuilding itself from the wasteland is rubble. The effort to reconstitute the rule of law and the institutions of organized society ended not in some sustainable, stable state, but in another catastrophic loss. This is a bleaker conclusion than the games offer directly, and whether it represents a genuine thematic position or simply a narrative choice made for dramatic effect is one of the more interesting questions the show raises. The Fallout universe has always maintained a tension between cynicism and hope, between the argument that institutions inevitably fail and the argument that specific individuals within and around institutions can make choices that matter. The show seems to be coming down more firmly on the cynical side of this tension than the games typically do, though the character of Lucy McLean, whose optimism is tested repeatedly and survives each test in a modified but recognizable form, provides the human-scale counterweight to the institutional argument. Walton Goggins's performance as the Ghoul is the single best piece of acting in the history of Fallout media. This is not a difficult case to make. The character requires Goggins to simultaneously play a pre-war human and a 200-year-old ghoul without the luxury of two different actors sharing the role to make the ghoul's current behavior legible as the outcome of the pre-war human's choices and experiences without any direct connection between the two performances other than the fact that they are the same person. He accomplishes this through physical work as much as through dialogue. The way the ghoul moves, the specific economy of his violence, the moments where something from the pre-war flashbacks surfaces in the contemporary scenes in ways that are not announced and not explained and require only the audience's attention to recognize. The show produced a significant surge in player counts for Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 4 immediately following its release, with New Vegas seeing particularly dramatic increases in active players. This was both predictable and significant. Predictable because the show referenced New Vegas's geography and political history, specifically enough to make players curious about the source material. Significant because New Vegas is a 16-year-old game running on hardware and software architecture that is considerably less accessible than contemporary releases. Players who had not encountered it in the years after its original release downloaded it specifically because the show made them want to spend time in that world, and many of them stayed much longer than they expected. Conversations about a remaster of Fallout New Vegas became substantially louder in the months following the show's release. These conversations had been ongoing in the community for years, but the show's success made the commercial argument for a remaster considerably easier to construct. Here was demonstrated evidence that a new audience existed for this franchise. Here were players specifically seeking out older entries. Here was a window in which a polished version of the game most people considered the franchise's creative peak could find an audience that did not need to be convinced the franchise was worth engaging with. Whether a remaster happened or will happen, or what form it might take, remains a matter of community discussion rather than confirmed corporate intention. What the show definitively established is that Fallout works as a medium-independent franchise in a way that most comparable adaptations do not. The visual language of the games, the retro-futuristic aesthetic, the specific categories of creature and faction and architecture, all translated into live action without becoming either parody or po-faced fan service. The show understood what the games were actually about, the institutional critique, the specific kind of dark humor, the emotional investment in characters who are trying to be decent in conditions that make decency expensive, and it made television out of those understandings, rather than out of the surface features. Part 12. Why the Wasteland Stays With You. There is something particular about the way Fallout ends that is different from almost any other franchise of comparable size. The credits roll, or the game's final slideshow, narrates the consequences of your choices across the world you have been moving through, and you sit with a feeling that is not quite satisfaction, and not quite melancholy, but something in the space between them. A kind of earned quiet. The feeling you get after a long walk through unfamiliar territory where you found things you did not expect to find and learned things you were not specifically looking for, and now you are back, and the walk is over, and you are different in some way that would be hard to specify precisely. This feeling is the design, not in the sense that it was planned as a target emotional outcome, but in the sense that everything about how Fallout is structured tends in this direction when it works well. The pacing, the way the games reward slowness rather than speed, the way the most important things are usually found by wandering rather than by following the path most directly toward the objective. The radio in the background, providing this mixture of sweetness and distance. The architecture of decay, which asks you to look at broken things long enough to see what they once were and what they wanted to be and what it cost them to fall short. Tim Kaine, in a 2011 blog post written while working on the Ender Dragon fight in a different project entirely, described the stages of his own creative process with unusual honesty: inspiration, motivation, stress, and abandonment. He described inspiration as 5 out of 5 for fun. He described abandonment as inevitable. He posted this on a public blog while actively experiencing the end of his creative investment in a specific thing, using the writing not as performance but as documentation, trying to name what was happening to him before it was fully over. Weeks after the post, he stepped away from Minecraft's development. The blog was, retrospectively, a goodbye letter that nobody knew to read as a goodbye letter while it was being written. Something similar could be said about the original Fallout's development. It was made by people who were not entirely sure it would be finished, who were not entirely sure anyone would play it if it was finished, who worked at a pace and with a commitment that the circumstances did not fully justify if you were operating on purely rational expectations. Tim Kaine believed in it when there were very good reasons not to believe in it. Chris Taylor wrote an entire rule system in his spare time because he could see what the game could be and was not willing to let a licensing failure prevent it from being that. Mark Morgan scored The End of the World with sounds drawn from world music and industrial ambient and whatever else was available in the specific combination that the world he was scoring required. These were individual acts of creative conviction in conditions that consistently made conviction difficult to maintain. The franchise that resulted from these acts has survived for nearly 30 years, through corporate acquisitions and studio closures and failed sequels, and a television adaptation that turned out to be better than anyone had a right to expect. It has produced some of the finest writing in the medium, some of the most sophisticated faction design, some of the most ambitious environmental storytelling, and at least one piece of ambient music that people who never played the game have described as a significant part of their emotional life. The institutional critique at the heart of Fallout is not a clever choice of theme that happens to lend itself to post-apocalyptic settings. It is the thing the series has always been specifically about, the argument it has been making in every possible format since Tim Kaine first put together a prototype in a California office, while the rest of Interplay worked on other things. Institutions fail the people they claim to serve. Authority without accountability becomes monstrous. The machinery of civilization can be turned against civilization with very little difficulty if the right people are in charge and the wrong systems of accountability are absent. These are not abstract propositions. Every Vault experiment, every NCR corruption terminal entry, every Brotherhood of Steel document about the events at Mariposa, every piece of Enclave propaganda is evidence in the series' sustained argument that these things are true and that the evidence is everywhere if you are willing to look at it. But the series does not end at cynicism. This is the most important thing to understand about Fallout, and the reason it has retained genuine emotional power across 30 years of cultural change. The argument about institutional failure is real, and it is documented, and it is the game's most consistent intellectual content. And, alongside it, distributed through every game in precisely the arrangements that make it discoverable without being announced, is a counter-argument made not through political philosophy or faction ideology, but through the behavior of specific individuals. The scientist in Vault 81, who spent his professional life sabotaging an experiment that was harming people, knowing that he could not report it and could not stop it through official channels, choosing instead to do what he could do within the constraints he could not change. The original Fallout's ending, in which the player character is asked to leave the vault they saved because the Overseer fears the changes that contact with the outside world might bring, a moment of pure institutional logic that is also a genuine and devastating betrayal. Uncle Leo wandering the capital wasteland with his unlikely contemplative piece, a scripting error that the development team converted into one of the series' most resonant portraits of persistence. Dogmeat, in every game, being simply what the series designers needed someone to be in these stories, about institutions that fail, a thing that is loyal without agenda, that does not calculate and does not strategize, that follows you because following you is the whole of its purpose, asking nothing about where you are going and requiring nothing in return for the company. The wasteland stays with you because it is about things that are true. The specific flavor of its truth is dark, and it does not offer easy resolutions, and it trusts you to bring your own emotional weight to the stories it tells rather than doing that work for you. But the darkness is illuminated by the persistence of specific people who chose differently, who found the cost of conscience bearable or at least worth bearing, who did what they could with what they had when they had it. You are one of those people, in every Fallout game. The choices you make are consequential. The world changes around them, records them in its terminal entries, and its faction reputation systems, and its final slideshows. You walk through a world built on institutional failure and made decisions that became part of that world's history. Whether those decisions made things better is a question the games are honest enough to leave genuinely open, because making things genuinely better in a broken world is hard and uncertain and depends on things beyond any individual's control. But you were there. You found the messages in the bottles. You read the holotapes of people who did not survive long enough to know you were listening. You sat in Vault 11 and understood what happened there, and in Vault 81 and understood what almost happened there and why it did not, and in the ruins of Shady Sands and in the long, dark corridors below Mariposa, and in the quiet of a house in Sanctuary Hills, where a family used to live, and where one of them is trying to understand what that past means for who they are in. The present. The wasteland stays with you because you left something of yourself there. That is what good stories do. They are places you can visit and never entirely leave, places that go on existing in some corner of your understanding of the world, and that occasionally surface when something in your actual life rhymes with something in the fiction. When you recognize an institutional logic from the terminal entries in the behavior of something real, when you hear a mid-century song in a context that makes the gap between the melody and the situation feel like exactly the feeling Fallout was trying to create. Mark Morgan is still composing. Josh Sawyer still talks to the Fallout community with a patience and openness that is uncommon for someone who has been doing what he does for as long as he has been doing it. Tim Kaine has spent years in various studios making various games, and he still talks about the original Fallout with the specific combination of affection and clear-eyed realism that you develop when you make something that matters and understand exactly what it cost. The people who built these games put something real into them, something that went past professional obligation into the territory of genuine creative conviction, and the work holds that conviction the way old buildings hold the intentions of their architects, visible to anyone who looks carefully enough and knows what they are looking for. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland with me. If there is a specific fact or story from tonight that stayed with you, something that surprised you or moved you or recontextualized something you thought you already understood, drop it in the comments. I read them. These take a long time to put together, and knowing which parts landed means a lot for where I take future videos. If you are new here and this was your first time visiting the channel, please consider subscribing. There is a lot more where this came from, across other franchises and other stories, and I make all of it with the same care and the same conviction that the details matter and the depth is worth reaching for. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you sleep well tonight. The wasteland will still be there in the morning, and so will I. Part 13. The Lore of the Great War. Everything that led to the day the world ended. The specific date of the nuclear exchange that ended the old world and began the Fallout universe is October 23, 2077. This date is canonical across all official Fallout media, repeated in terminal entries and historical documents and museum exhibits, scattered through the ruins of every city and vault and abandoned research facility in the games. It is treated with the gravity of a sacred date, the way certain historical events are treated when their significance is large enough that they become organizational, around which all subsequent understanding arranges itself. Everything in the Fallout universe is dated in relation to that day. Before the war, after the war. The date itself has a name, the Great War. The Great War lasted approximately 2 hours. From the first nuclear detonation to the cessation of active hostilities, roughly 2 hours elapsed. 2 hours to end a civilization that had been building for millennia. 2 hours to reduce to slag and ash and drifting particulate matter the accumulated physical infrastructure of centuries of human effort. The swiftness of it is part of the horror that the games keep returning to. There was not an extended period of warning, not a gradual intensification of conflict that gave people time to adjust their understanding of what was happening and respond with something like deliberation. There was ordinary life, and then there was the end of ordinary life, and the gap between them was shorter than a long movie. The conflict was fought primarily between the United States of America and China, though the Fallout universe's geopolitical structure by 2077 was considerably more complex than a simple bilateral conflict. The resource crisis that precipitated the war, specifically the global collapse of petroleum reserves, had been grinding through international relations for over 2 decades by the time of the Great War, reshaping alliances and territorial ambitions and the internal politics of every major nation in ways that made stability increasingly difficult to maintain. Alaska. China had invaded Alaska in the game's historical timeline to secure access to the petroleum reserves in the Alaskan wilderness, and the United States had committed resources to the subsequent liberation of Alaskan territory on a scale that accelerated the economic deterioration that was already threatening the home front. This is where the Fallout universe's alternate history becomes richest and most interesting to trace, because the specific divergence point from actual historical development is usually placed around the end of the Second World War, around the moment when, in the real world, the transistor was developed and electronics began their rapid miniaturization. In the Fallout universe, this technological transition did not happen. Vacuum tube technology continued to dominate electronics development. The result was a world that had atomic energy in abundance, but not the microelectronics revolution. A world where computers existed but were the size of rooms rather than pockets, where automation was possible but not ubiquitous, where the consumer landscape of the 1950s was stretched forward by inertia through decades that would, in reality, have transformed it beyond recognition. This technological stasis is not incidental to the political situation that produced the Great War. The Fallout universe's version of the late 21st century is not simply the late 20th century with better rockets. It is a world where certain specific kinds of progress happened, primarily in nuclear physics, materials science, and military technology, while other equally important kinds of progress did not happen, specifically in information technology, telecommunications, and the democratization of knowledge that personal computing eventually enabled. The result is a world where institutional power is more concentrated, where information is more controlled, where the mechanisms by which ordinary people can develop independent understandings of their political situation are more limited than they became in the actual historical timeline. This is why the propaganda in the Fallout universe works as well as it does. The recruitment posters, the Vault Tech advertisements, the government-issued public information films that still play on functioning pre-war terminals, these are not simply dark humor. They are accurate representations of a media environment where the institutions responsible for producing public information also control the means of its distribution, where there is no robust independent press, no decentralized information network, no mechanism by which inconvenient truths can reliably reach the people they are most relevant to. The Vault-Tec advertising worked because it was the only story being told. The government propaganda worked because there was no institutional structure capable of providing an alternative at scale. The military technology developed during the resource wars of the mid-21st century shaped the physical landscape of the wasteland in ways that the games document through the ruins that remain visible. Power armor, one of the franchise's most iconic visual and mechanical elements, was developed by the United States military in the 2050s as a response to the escalating conventional warfare that the resource crisis was producing. The T-45 model, the earliest variant to appear in the games, was deployed to Anchorage during the Alaskan campaign and represented the first practical military exoskeleton capable of sustained field operation. Power armor development continued through the T-51 model, which the game's documentation treats as the definitive pre-war pinnacle and into the experimental T-60 and X-1 models that were in development or limited production at the time of the Great War. The Brotherhood of Steel's institutional focus on collecting and preserving this technology reflects both its practical military value in the post-war environment and its symbolic significance as the most dramatic expression of what pre-war technological ambition could achieve. Walking through the wasteland in power armor is walking through the wasteland in a piece of the old world's confidence in itself, wearing the product of an investment in human capability that the war rendered simultaneously meaningful and pointless. The forced evolutionary virus that produces the super mutants of the East Coast games was developed at Mariposa Military Base as part of the Resource Wars arms race, specifically as an attempt to create soldiers enhanced beyond normal human parameters without requiring the massive material infrastructure that power armor development demanded. The virus's effects on human biology were documented extensively in the base's pre-war terminal entries that Roger Maxon's mutiny prevented from being applied to the scale of deployment the military had planned. The FEV research continued in other facilities, including the Institute's early ancestor programs, and the consequences of this research branch through the genetic history of every supermutant population in the games. The ghoul phenomenon, which the show and the games treat as the inevitable outcome of radiation exposure under specific conditions, has a pre-war history that is less fully documented than most of the franchise's other elements of biological transformation. The first ghouls appear to have been created by the initial nuclear exchange, by exposure to radiation at concentrations high enough to fundamentally alter human biology without killing the subject outright. Some of these individuals retained their cognitive function essentially intact while losing whatever process it was that made human cellular aging operate normally. Others experienced cognitive degradation to the point of behavioral feral states indistinguishable from highly aggressive animals. The distinction between these outcomes, why some individuals retained personhood and others did not, has never been satisfactorily explained by any in-universe scientific source, and the games treat this uncertainty as realistic rather than as a narrative gap requiring closure. 200 years of ghoul existence in the Fallout universe has produced a small population of people with direct experiential memory of the world before the Great War, people who were children or adults when the bombs fell, and who have lived long enough to see everything that has grown up in the ruins since. The ghoul characters who populate every major game tend to use this perspective differently. Some carry their history as a burden, unable to fully inhabit a present that bears no relationship to the world they grew up in. Some have shed the past as thoroughly as they shed the physical markers of pre-war humanity. A few, like the ghoul in the television show or like the dry goods store owner Harold in Fallout 3, have developed a relationship with their own extended temporal existence that is genuinely philosophical, that has produced, through the slow pressure of 200 years, something resembling wisdom. Harold in particular deserves extended discussion. He is one of the original Fallout's most memorable characters and one of its most persistent recurring presences across multiple games. He appears in the original Fallout as a ghoul trader with an unusual companion, a plant growing from his head that he calls Herbert. By Fallout 3, set 39 years later and on the other side of the continent, Harold has been found again, and what has happened to him in the intervening decades is one of the most extraordinary character developments in the series. The plant has grown. It has grown considerably. Harold is now immobile at the center of a forest that has grown from his body, the plant extending roots into the surrounding soil, producing an oasis of life in the wasteland that Harold himself regards with a mixture of pride and despair. He did not choose to be this. He did not choose to be anything, across a sequence of transformations that has taken him further and further from whatever he started as until the category of human hardly seems to apply. He wants to die in Fallout 3, with a genuine and clearly reasoned conviction that his continuation is more burden than gift. He asks the player to help him achieve this, and the player must choose whether to grant his request or to convince him that his continued existence is valuable enough to justify the suffering it involves. The game presents both positions with enough genuine complexity that neither feels like the obviously correct choice. Harold is the wasteland's most fully realized meditation on what extended survival costs, what it means to outlast everything you were connected to, what kind of meaning can be constructed in the ruins of a life that has become something unrecognizable from its starting point. The pre-war advertising that decorates the wasteland's ruins constitutes its own form of historical documentation. The specific goods being advertised, the specific promises being made about those goods, the visual language through which those promises are communicated, all of this creates a picture of the consumer culture that existed in the Fallout universe's final years. Vim. Soda, a regional beverage brand from the main area featured in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, was being advertised with a folksy authenticity that was itself a sophisticated marketing strategy, presenting mass-produced consumer goods as products of regional identity and local pride. The Nuka-Cola Corporation's ubiquitous vending machines and billboard campaigns demonstrate a brand presence that had thoroughly colonized public space, the kind of corporate visibility that requires decades of sustained investment to achieve and that erases whatever preceded it in a way that leaves no visible trace of what came before. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Company of the Mojave, central to a significant questline in Fallout New Vegas, had built its brand identity around the mythology of the frontier West, the cowboy aesthetic, and the open-sky promises of freedom and authenticity that the actual frontier experience had traded in during the 19th century, and that advertising had been mining as a resource ever since. The specific blue star bottle cap that drives the questline functions as a window into how consumer culture generates loyalty that outlasts the original product, how the mythology attached to a commodity can develop an independent existence that the commodity itself no longer needs to sustain. All of this advertising persisted through the Great War and into the ruins because it was printed on metal and painted on walls and stamped into the physical landscape in forms designed to outlast the attention spans of consumers. The advertisements are still selling products that no longer exist to people who are no longer alive in a world that no longer functions in any way that would make the products meaningful. And yet they persist, and players read them, and the specific promises being made in specific advertising languages create an emotional texture that no amount of developer-written historical documents could produce as efficiently. The world's history is in its commercial ephemera, in the mundane residue of a consumer culture that spent the last years before the end of the world continuing to sell things to people, because selling things was what the economy knew how to do, and the economy did not know how to stop. Part 14. The Technical World. How the games actually work and what that reveals. Fallout 3 and New Vegas ran on the Gamebryo engine, a middleware technology originally developed for use in the Elder Scrolls series, and adapted by Bethesda for increasingly complex open-world environments. Understanding something about how this engine works is genuinely useful for understanding the game's specific character, why they feel the way they feel, what kinds of things are possible within them, and what kinds of things are not, and why the bugs they produce tend to have a particular flavor that is recognizable and, in some cases, beloved. Gamebryo was not designed for the scale of environments that Fallout 3 and New Vegas asked it to manage. The Capital Wasteland, at its broadest, is an enormous territory that the engine is constantly making decisions about how to represent, streaming geometry and textures and object data in and out of active memory as the player moves through it, making judgment calls about what is close enough to render at full detail and what is distant enough to simplify or defer. These streaming calculations, running continuously in the background of the player's experience, produce the characteristic loading hiccups and occasional geometric glitches that anyone who spent significant time with these games will recognize. The moment when a piece of the world failed to load in time and hung visible as a floating object in an incorrect position, or when the terrain streaming made a sudden recalculation that briefly revealed the scaffolding underneath the world. The VATS system, the Vault-Tech-assisted targeting system that allows players to pause time and select specific body parts for targeted attacks, is one of the franchise's most elegant solutions to a design problem that could have been handled far less elegantly. The original Fallout games were turn-based, and in that context, the ability to target specific body parts was simply part of the action economy. Each shot consumed action points, and choosing a specific target was a tactical decision made within the turn structure. When Bethesda moved Fallout 3 to a real-time first-person perspective, they faced the question of how to preserve this tactical dimension without converting the entire game to turn-based play. VATS slows time to a near stop rather than stopping it completely, giving the player a moment of strategic decision-making embedded in an otherwise continuous action sequence. The hit percentages displayed for each body part are calculated from a combination of the player character's relevant stats, the current distance to the target's size and mobility, and any obstruction between player and target. The percentages shown are genuinely calculated rather than aesthetic decoration, and learning to read them accurately is part of the skill the game rewards over time. The gore physics attached to VATS kill animations are one of the most frequently discussed aspects of Fallout 3's presentation, and they reflect a specific creative decision about what function the violence serves in the game's emotional economy. The kills are spectacular in a way that is deliberately excessive, that makes the violence feel less like realistic documentation of harm and more like an action film language, a cinematic shorthand for decisive impact that operates at one remove from the reality of what the game is literally depicting. Whether this distancing succeeds at its intended function, whether watching someone disintegrate in slow motion serves as sufficient emotional protection against the reality of what you are watching, is a question the games implicitly raise without quite answering. The Pip-Boy, the personal information processor worn on the player character's wrist, is one of the most successful interface designs in the history of the medium. As a diegetic inventory management system, it solves the fundamental design problem of how to let the player access complex management information without completely breaking the game's immersion by placing the interface inside the fiction rather than outside it. The Pip-Boy is a piece of equipment your character is wearing. Looking at it is something your character is doing. The menus are the menus your character would be navigating. The map is a map your character is reading on a screen on their arm. The specific design of the Pip-Boy, the chunky retro-futuristic hardware with its vacuum tube aesthetic and its green phosphor screen, is also a cultural argument. It looks like an artifact of the same technological trajectory that produced the world's nuclear apocalypse: heavy, mechanical, built for durability at the expense of elegance, the product of an engineering culture that valued robustness over miniaturization, and that did not have access to the transistor-based electronics that would have made smaller, lighter designs possible. The Pip-Boy looks like the world it documents, and that coherence is part of why it works as both an interface and a piece of environmental storytelling. The special systems implementation across different games is itself a study in the difficulty of adapting tabletop role-playing mechanics to digital play. The original system, designed for a game with action points and turn-based combat, assumed a set of relationships between player statistics and game outcomes that made intuitive sense in the turn-based context and required substantial redesigning for real-time implementation. Agility's role in determining action point pools is a direct inheritance from the original tabletop design, preserved across games despite the different ways action points function in different entries. Charisma's role in dialogue, which in the original games was tied to persuasion percentage modifiers and in later games to additional dialogue options, reflects the different ways the development teams conceptualized what high charisma should mean in practice. The Karma system, which tracks moral alignment in Fallout 3 and 4, has been one of the most consistently criticized mechanical decisions in the franchise's Bethesda era. The criticism has merit. The Karma system reduces the complex moral texture of the Fallout universe to a linear scale between good and evil, rewarding certain behaviors and penalizing others in ways that make the player's moral engagement feel like resource management rather than genuine ethical reasoning. New Vegas replaced the Karma system with a faction reputation system, which tracks not your absolute moral standing but your standing with specific organizations, reflecting the more sophisticated understanding of how morality actually works in complex social environments. Not as a linear metric of overall goodness, but as a set of specific relationships with specific communities. The item durability system that appeared in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, where weapons and armor degraded with use and required maintenance to remain effective, is another mechanical decision with interesting implications for the game's thematic content. Maintaining functional equipment in a world where replacement parts must be scavenged from the ruins of the civilization that originally produced them is an accurate representation of what long-term post-apocalyptic survival would actually require, and the degradation curves for different materials reflect genuine reasoning about what would hold up under field conditions and what would not. The tedium that many players associated with weapon maintenance reflects the same tedium that the game is trying to characterize as the real texture of surviving in the wasteland. It is not a design failure so much as a design honesty about what the game's setting would actually demand. Fallout 4's crafting system, which allows players to build settlements, modify weapons, and produce consumables from scavenged components, was the most ambitious attempt in the franchise to simulate the economy of surviving in ruins. Every piece of metal, every bottle of adhesive, every spring and screw and circuit has a destination. The structures you are building, the weapons you are upgrading, the armor you are reinforcing. The world's detritus becomes a resource economy, and managing this economy gives the open-world exploration a purpose beyond narrative advancement that some players found compelling and others found distracting from the story. The settlement-building system's connection to the franchise's thematic content is worth noting explicitly. Building settlements in Fallout 4 is an act of choosing, in the game's most literal mechanical sense, to reconstruct. To take the ruins and make something from them that serves a purpose, that provides shelter and resources, and a degree of security to the people who live in it. Every settlement is an argument in favor of the possibility of recovery, a small demonstration that the Great War is not the final word on what human beings can build in the territory they inhabit. The fact that settlement building is optional, that players can complete the game without engaging with it, reflects the game's overall philosophy about moral choice. Nothing is required of you, but everything is available, and what you choose to engage with says something about who you are deciding to be in the world you are moving through. The load screen tips that appear during Fallout 4's area transitions function as their own category of lore delivery, presenting technical information about game mechanics alongside historical information about the game's world in a format that players encounter dozens or hundreds of times during extended play. Many players have reported learning significant pieces of Fallout lore primarily through load screen tips, which are written with the same care as the in-game text, and which often contain information not available through any other in-game source. The loading screen is not dead time in Fallout 4. It is a delivery mechanism for the kind of factual detail that the open-world format can struggle to place in diegetically plausible locations. The companion AI systems across different Fallout games reflect the evolving understanding of what companions are supposed to provide emotionally and mechanically. Companions in the original games were simple followers. They moved with the player, engaged enemies, and carried items. Companions in the Bethesda games developed approval systems, preferences about player behavior, and story content that made them characters in their own right rather than equipment. New Vegas's companions represented the peak of this development, with approval systems tied to specific moral stances rather than simple, good, evil metrics, and with personal quest lines that gave each companion a genuine arc across the player's relationship with them. The artificial intelligence that governs enemy behavior in Fallout 3 and later games, which uses a combination of pathfinding algorithms and behavioral state machines to make enemies feel responsive to the player's actions, occasionally produces results that the players find funnier than they were designed to be. Super mutants navigating an obstacle course on their way to engage the player, briefly solving geometry problems with an earnest determination that makes their eventual arrival slightly anticlimactic. Rad scorpions burrowing in and out of terrain at unexpected angles. The combat AI for humanoid enemies, which can send them sprinting around corners to flank the player, occasionally sends them sprinting around corners into each other, producing pileups that the physics engine resolves with the kind of enthusiasm usually associated with cartoon slapstick. These moments are not failures of game design. They are evidence of what happens when complex AI systems interact with complex geometry under conditions of genuine player unpredictability, which is to say they are evidence that the simulation is rich enough to produce outcomes nobody planned. The Fallout games are wide enough, deep enough, and sufficiently populated with interacting systems that they consistently produce experiences that their developers could not have anticipated. And these unplanned experiences contribute to the game's longevity as much as any planned content does. Part 15. Companions, the people who walk with you. The companions of Fallout occupy a specific category in gaming's history of memorable characters because the conditions of the medium require them to be legible and engaging across an enormous variety of possible interactions, available at different points in the story for different amounts of time, capable of responding to player choices with appropriate reactions without knowing in advance which choices the player will make. Building a companion that works under these constraints is considerably harder than building a novel character who exists in a fixed narrative context. And the companions who succeed at it do so through a specific combination of strong core characterization and writing flexible enough to survive unexpected context. Boone, the NCR sharpshooter you recruit in Novak during Fallout New Vegas, represents the finest example of companion writing in the series. He is a man with a specific history that he cannot fully escape. A former 1st Recon marksman whose wife was sold to Caesar's Legion by someone in the town where they were living, and who has spent the time since working out a combination of guilt and grief that has settled into something quiet and controlled and very close to being finished with the world in a way he has not yet made a specific decision about. His dialogue is minimal by design, clipped and economical in the way that people become economical when they have decided that most language is not worth producing. But what he says, when he says it, carries the weight of everything the economy is protecting him from having to express directly. Recruiting Boone requires completing a specific quest that involves identifying which of Novak's residents was responsible for his wife's abduction. This quest has no definitive single answer that the game explicitly confirms. It presents evidence and lets you reach a conclusion and act on that conclusion. And Boone will accept your conclusion without question, because he has been waiting for someone to help him act rather than simply to help him understand. The question of whether you reach the right conclusion is left genuinely open by the game's design, which is the most sophisticated thing the quest does. It does not guarantee justice. It provides action, and action and justice are different things. Veronica in New Vegas is the companion whose quest most directly engages with the franchise's faction lore. A Brotherhood of Steel scribe who has grown up inside the organization and has legitimate doubts about whether the Brotherhood's institutional decisions are compatible with her understanding of what the Brotherhood was supposed for. Her arc requires the player to either help her find a way to change the Brotherhood from within, help her leave the Brotherhood entirely, or leave her in the situation she is already in without resolution. The game is honest about all three outcomes in ways that are specifically uncomfortable, because none of them are good in a comprehensive sense. The Brotherhood's institutional conservatism cannot be easily reformed by a single person's conviction. Leaving means abandoning the people she loves who remain. Staying means continuing to participate in decisions she finds morally unjustifiable. The framing of Veronica's quest as unresolvable in a fully satisfying way is one of New Vegas's most mature design decisions. The game refuses to tell you that there is an action you can take that will produce an outcome that is simply good, because the actual situation she is in does not allow for simply good outcomes. This is the institutional critique expressed through personal terms, through the story of a specific individual trying to navigate the gap between what an institution is and what it claims to be, trying to remain a person of conscience inside a structure that is increasingly demanding decisions that conscience cannot support. Hancock in Fallout 4 is a ghoul who runs a settlement called Good Neighbor, with a philosophy that combines genuine care for the residents with a kind of principled lawlessness, a conviction that the rules that work in ordinary communities do not necessarily work for communities of people who have been rejected or marginalized by every other social structure available to them. He was, before becoming a ghoul, a politician from the Diamond City establishment whose increasing radicalization was triggered by specific injustice he witnessed and could not address through the available legitimate channels. The radicalization did not make him nihilistic. It made him specific about which injustices he was willing to tolerate and which he was not. His approval of the player character's behavior tracks this philosophy. He responds positively to decisions that protect the marginalized, to confrontations with authority that has become abusive, to the specific kind of principled defiance that his own history has taught him to value. He responds negatively to decisions that exploit the weak or defer to power without questioning whether that power has been legitimately exercised. He is one of the most politically coherent characters in Fallout 4, a game that is sometimes criticized for the thinness of its political content, because his personal philosophy is derived from specific experience and specific reasoning, rather than from a general disposition toward good or evil. Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Diamond City, uses the companion role to explore one of Fallout 4's central philosophical questions. What is the relationship between consciousness and personhood? Between the continuity of memory and the continuity of self? Nick is a Gen 2 synth who carries the uploaded memories of a pre-war detective named Nick Valentine, memories that include a relationship, a career, and a specific historical moment of loss that shapes his entire post-war self-understanding. The original Nick Valentine is long dead. The synth who carries his memories is not him in any biological sense. But the memories are real, and the emotional relationships those memories imply are the relationships the synth Nick actually has with the world, and the question of what this means for his status as a person is one the game raises seriously and does not answer conclusively. Nick's companion quest explores this territory with genuine thoughtfulness, using the specific circumstances of his history to raise questions about identity, memory, and moral responsibility that are not solvable through combat or dialogue options. The resolution of his quest is satisfying not because it provides a definitive answer, but because it allows him to make a specific peace with the questions that cannot be answered, to integrate the uncertainty into an ongoing selfhood, rather than requiring the uncertainty to be resolved before personhood can be claimed. Preston Garvey, who has generated something of a reputation as the franchise's most relentlessly task-assigning companion, is worth reconsidering in the context of what his design is actually attempting. Preston represents the Minutemen, a collapsed faction whose central ideal, the obligation of organized people to help isolated and vulnerable people who cannot protect themselves, is the most fundamental and least ideologically specific of any faction's organizing principle. He does not ask you to support a political philosophy or accept a specific institutional structure. He asks you to help people who need help, and the help he asks you to provide is specific and concrete. Go to this settlement, address this problem, make this community less vulnerable than it currently is. The criticism of Preston's settlement quests usually focuses on their repetitive structure, which is legitimate. But the repetition is also in some sense the point. The work of maintaining communities, of providing the ongoing security and problem-solving that allows ordinary life to function, does not occur in dramatic singular moments. It occurs in the accumulation of small, specific acts of assistance that have to be repeated because the problems they address are not resolved permanently, but managed continuously. Preston's quests are dull in the same way that genuinely necessary work is often dull, and the Minutemen's ideology is specifically about the willingness to do that dull, necessary work rather than waiting for a moment dramatic enough to justify engagement. The way different companions interact with each other when multiple companions are hypothetically in the same space, an interaction the shipped games do not support mechanically, but that the companion writing implies through their individual characterizations, is one of the most interesting speculative territories in the franchise. Boone and Arcade Gannon, for instance, share a specific history of NCR involvement and specific political positions that would make their coexistence interesting in ways the game cannot dramatize. Veronica and Elder McNamara have a relationship defined by institutional conflict that the companion system cannot quite capture. The companions exist in the same world, have opinions about each other that can be accessed through dialogue, and yet the mechanical design keeps them separated in ways that prevent these relationships from being experienced directly. This is one of the genuine limitations of the companion system as the Fallout games have implemented it, and it is a limitation that reflects the enormous technical complexity of having multiple AI agents with complex behavioral systems operating simultaneously in the same space. Managing the interactions between even two companions at the level of detail that Fallout companions are characterized at would require a different order of design investment than the games have historically been able to make. The limitation is real and its absence is felt, but understanding why the absence exists makes it less like a failure and more like an indication of how much depth the character writing has achieved relative to what the mechanical systems can actually support. The animals that function as companions in different games deserve acknowledgement in this context as well. Rex, the cybernetic dog from New Vegas with its own companion quest involving brain transplants, is a portrait of the specific kind of loyalty that the franchise keeps returning to through the dog meat figure. An animal that asks nothing conceptually, that exists in a state of pure relationship without the complicating factors of ideology or institutional loyalty or historical grievance that make human relationships in the wasteland so complex. Rex has a history that shapes his capabilities and his companion quest, but he experiences that history without the burden of retrospective analysis that makes human histories into wounds. He is simply present, in the way that animals are present, which is the only way of being present that the wasteland consistently makes available. Companions are the franchise's answer to the question of what you are doing in the wasteland beyond surviving. You are building relationships in a world that has made relationships expensive and precarious, maintaining connections across distances and dangers that could dissolve them at any moment, choosing to be accompanied by specific people for reasons that the game's approval systems can track, but that the player experiences as something more personal than a reputation score. The companions are the Wasteland's argument that survival without relationship is insufficient, that the human capacity for specific attachment is not a vulnerability to be eliminated but a feature to be preserved, one of the things worth recovering when the catastrophe is finally far enough in the past to start thinking about what recovery means. Part 16. The Aesthetics of Ruin. Why the Wasteland is Beautiful. There is a specific kind of beauty that the Fallout universe has made its own. A beauty that does not come from wholeness or perfection or the kind of visual harmony that traditional aesthetics tends to celebrate, but from what survives after wholeness is lost. The Wasteland is not ugly. This is one of the most important and least obvious things about it, and it is the quality that makes the game's visual experience something other than simple documentation of horror. The Wasteland has an aesthetic. It has a visual logic. It has a relationship between its parts that produces an experience closer to the sublime than to the merely depressing, and understanding why this is true reveals something about why the franchise has proven so enduringly attractive to the people who spend time inside it. The color palettes of different Fallout games are one of the most immediately distinctive elements of the series' visual identity. Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland is deliberately washed out, filtered through a gray-green haze that desaturates everything to a degree slightly past what the post-apocalyptic content would strictly require. This desaturation is a choice about what color means in this world. In the old world, color was abundant, was deployed in advertisements and consumer goods and architecture to signal vitality and aspiration and optimism. In the Wasteland, color has to be earned. The few moments of genuine color in Fallout 3's landscape, a sunset filtered through dust clouds, the red of a sunset against the ruins of the Capitol Dome, the incongruous green of growing things in sheltered corners, read as emotionally significant precisely because of the gray that surrounds them. New Vegas made a different set of color choices that reflect its different emotional register. The Mojave is not gray-green but warm and dusty, golden and tan and ochre, in ways that communicate aridity and heat rather than the cold exhaustion of the Capital Wasteland. The neon of the Strip, when you first see it from a distance at night, is almost overwhelming in the context of the surrounding terrain, a concentrated pocket of the old world's love of light and color surviving in the desert like an architectural mirage. The Strip is deliberately excessive in exactly the way that Las Vegas was deliberately excessive before the bombs, and the game's visual design uses that excess as a characterization. This is what the old world looked like when it was celebrating itself, and even 200 years later it is still doing so, maintained by an AI with the resources and the inclination to keep the lights on indefinitely. The architectural vocabulary of Fallout's ruined cities is built from real-world references that the development team studied extensively during production. The specific ways that real buildings decay, the sequence in which structural elements fail, the patterns that emerge when wood rots and metal rusts and concrete spalls and glass finally falls out of frames after years of thermal cycling, all of this informs the visual design of the game's environments at a level that most players experience as general authenticity without being able to specify where it comes from. Real photos of Detroit's abandoned industrial buildings, real documentation of the specific visual character of American urban decay, fed into the texture work and the geometry and the placement of objects in ways that make the game's ruins feel like somewhere rather than like somewhere fictional. The specific detail density of Fallout 4's Boston, compared to Fallout 3's Washington, D.C., reflects the different technical capabilities available to the development team a generation later. The ruins of Boston are visually denser, with more individual objects, more complex interior spaces, more layering of different decay states in the same environment than anything in Fallout 3's Capital. This density creates a different kind of aesthetic experience. Rather than the spare, melancholy emptiness of 3's DC, 4's Boston feels overwhelmingly full, as though 200 years of entropy has been adding things rather than removing them, piling ruined objects on top of ruined objects in arrangements that no longer follow any organizing principle except the logic of collapse. Lighting in the Fallout games is one of the technical elements most responsible for the emotional quality of different environments, and it has become progressively more sophisticated with each generation of hardware. The interior spaces of vaults in New Vegas used lighting specifically calibrated to communicate the quality of space those environments were trying to create. The harsh fluorescence of functional areas, the warmer and dimmer lighting of residential sections, the specific quality of emergency lighting that suggests something important has gone wrong without specifying what. Walking through different sections of a vault in New Vegas, you can track your emotional state against the lighting changes and find that they correspond precisely to the narrative expectations the area is designed to create. Fallout 4's God Rays, the visible shafts of light that fall through dust-filled air and broken windows and gap structures to illuminate specific areas of the environment, were, at the time of the game's release, technically impressive and visually effective in ways that players commented on frequently. God rays in post-apocalyptic fiction have become almost a shorthand for a particular aesthetic, the beauty of light persisting in damaged spaces, and Fallout 4 used them with a frequency that was occasionally criticized as excessive, but that reflected a genuine understanding of what they do emotionally. Light falling through a broken ceiling into a ruined room says something about the persistence of the physical world independent of the catastrophes that the human world undergoes. The physics of light do not care about the bombs. They continue doing what they do regardless of what happened to the people below. The Pip-Boy's green-on-black interface color scheme, inherited from actual early computer terminal design, creates a visual language that communicates simultaneously the game's alternate history and the player's relationship to information within that history. The Pip-Boy looks like what it is, a tool from a technological tradition that took vacuum tube electronics in a different direction from what happened in reality, producing devices that are powerful and durable, but that carry their operational state in a visual form that makes the technology's nature immediately legible. Looking at the Pip-Boy is looking at a piece of the old world's specific vision of what progress looked like, and that vision is simultaneously strange and coherent, alien and recognizable in a way that is characteristic of the entire franchise's visual approach to its alternate history. The creatures of the wasteland function as another visual argument about what 200 years of specific environmental conditions produce in biological systems. Rad scorpions are scorpions, familiar enough in their basic body plan that the recognition is immediate but scaled up and mutated in ways that make the original creature a starting point rather than a conclusion, a template that 2 centuries of radiation exposure have elaborated into something that carries the recognizable structure but has become something genuinely other. Deathclaws, by contrast, are original designs whose visual vocabulary of predatory efficiency has been refined through multiple games into one of the most effective monster designs in the medium. Something that reads immediately as dangerous, not through supernatural quality, but through the brutal competence of its anatomy. Every aspect of its body designed for the single purpose of being very good at killing things. The environmental storytelling capacity of creature placement deserves its own acknowledgement here. The location of specific creatures in specific environments is often not random but narratively motivated, with creature territories chosen to communicate something about the history of the space they now occupy. A Deathclaw nesting in the ruins of a military installation implies a specific history of that location that the absence of human documentation might otherwise leave illegible. Mirelurks inhabiting a riverside settlement whose human population has clearly been gone for many years raises specific questions about the sequence of events that produce this arrangement. The wildlife is part of the text. The aesthetic of the Fallout universe is ultimately an aesthetic of persistence and transformation, of what survives catastrophe and what it becomes in surviving. The world it depicts is not simply destroyed. It is changed, in ways that are sometimes grotesque and sometimes beautiful, and sometimes both simultaneously, in ways that produce a visual environment that is genuinely unlike any other in gaming. Moving through that environment over the many hours that a full Fallout playthrough requires is an experience of aesthetic immersion that affects the player's relationship to its content in ways that are not fully separable from the intellectual and emotional content of the story. You are not just receiving information about a post-apocalyptic world. You are inside one. And the inside of it is gorgeous and terrible in proportions that shift depending on where you are standing and what direction you are facing. This beauty has a function beyond aesthetic pleasure. It creates the conditions for the kind of attachment that makes the game's emotional content land with the weight it carries. You care about what happened here because here is genuinely worth caring about, because the ruined world is beautiful in ways that make its ruination feel like a loss rather than a neutral fact, because the old world whose end you are moving through was capable of producing things worth mourning. The design of the wasteland is itself an argument for the humanity of the civilization that it replaced, an argument made visually, through the accumulated evidence of what those people built and how it fell, presented in a form that requires no explicit statement and admits of no straightforward refutation. The light is still falling through the broken windows. The music is still playing on the radio. The vending machines still have inventory. And somewhere in the ruins, a holotape is waiting that someone recorded at the moment when everything they knew was ending, and it has been waiting for 200 years for someone to find it and press play and hear what they had to say, which was not different from what any of us would want to say in that moment. I was here, this was real, and I wanted it to last. The franchise's longevity is inseparable from this quality. Games with interesting mechanics become dated when better mechanics arrive. Games with interesting worlds become dated when better technology allows more detailed world building. But games that build worlds capable of producing genuine feeling, worlds where the environment is doing emotional work rather than simply aesthetic work, where the ruins are mourning something real rather than simply looking impressive, those games occupy a different category. They do not date in the same way. They become historical artifacts in the productive sense, records of specific creative decisions made by specific people at a specific moment, decisions that captured something true and preserved it in a form that subsequent technical improvements cannot make more true. The people who made Fallout in 1997 could not have imagined the technical capabilities of the games that bear that name today, but they established the emotional register, the specific quality of melancholy and dark humor and institutional critique and genuine care for human detail that every subsequent game has been working within, reaching toward, and occasionally achieving in moments of real creative brilliance. The Wasteland is a place people return to, not for the mechanics, not for the graphics, not for the technical systems, though all of these have their genuine merits. They return for the feeling, the specific quality of attention the games ask of and reward in the people who play them, the sense that something real is being communicated about the human capacity for both catastrophic failure and quiet persistence. That is what Tim Kaine built when he was working essentially alone in an office in California. That is what survives. Thank you for being here tonight. For the like, if you feel like the work warranted it. For the subscription, if you want to come back. And for the comment, wherever you are, whatever the hour, telling me which part of this found you. The Wasteland will be here, so will I.